Hey guys, welcome back to my campfire. I have two awesome stories to share with you tonight. One of them is about a woman in Japan in the early 2000s who has this totally bizarre thing happen to her while she's on a train in Japan. And the reason we know about it is because she documented what happened to her in real time on social media. Very bizarre. And the second story I'm going to share with you is about this really creepy creature that apparently lives up in the mountains of northern Thailand. And there's this really just horrible encounter that this whole village had with it that, has sort of become a legend over time. And apparently this is not an isolated instance, that out in northern Thailand, this is a thing. It's very creepy. But before we get into tonight's two stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire, because that's all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and go to their DVD collection and go ahead and pull all the cases out, remove the actual disc, close the cases, and put them all back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into tonight's stories. Around 11 p.m. on January 8, 2004, a woman in her early 20s named Hasumi was sitting on a train that was speeding through the city of Hamamatsu, Japan. And as she rode along, she found herself staring anxiously out the window. So Hasumi took this train every night to get to her overnight shift at work, and usually it was a quick ride, maybe about 7 or 8 minutes, and there were a whole bunch of stops along those 7 or 8 minutes before she arrived at her destination. But tonight, she had just realized that she had actually been on the train now for at least 20 minutes, and she also hadn't stopped at any point. The train had just started and had been going for 20 minutes, and now she's realizing, wait a minute, am I on the wrong train? And so Hasumi began looking around the inside of this train car she was in to see if there was some signage that would say what train she was on, but as she looked inside the car, there was nothing. There was no signage one way or another. It was blank inside of this car, and she couldn't recall if that was how all the trains looked, but it seemed odd that there was nothing indicating what train she was on. And so she was thinking okay, well, maybe I've just missed my stop, and what I need to do is just get off at the next stop and maybe take a train back the way I came. And she's like, man, I'm already so late for work here, and the train at this point is still just chugging along here, there's no sign of it stopping. And so she looked around in the train car, sort of thinking what should I do here? And she saw there were several other passengers that were on board the train, but this is late at night. It's past 11 o'clock, and so everybody on the train was asleep, the few passengers that were there. And so she knows, I think my best bet here is probably to go wake one of these people up and just ask them, what train is this? But, she was pretty nervous, sort of a shy person, and she really didn't want to do that. And so she wound up actually just calling her parents, even though, how would they know what train she was on? But they didn't pick up. And so she kind of just felt stuck, she really didn't know what to do here. However, as Hasumi is sort of sitting there getting more and more anxious by the minute, she realized she actually might have a pretty easy solution here. So she had a cell phone. This is 2004. She had a phone, but it was not a smartphone like we have today, but it was a phone. And on her phone, she actually did have limited internet access. There was a way to connect to the internet, again, very limited. But through this limited internet access, she was able to access this very popular online forum in Japan that was called 2chan. So 2chan was sort of an early version of Reddit, where basically, people were able to post, various threads with questions, with statements, with polls, you name it. You could just sort of, post your thoughts on 2chan, and then other people, other users could jump on there and leave comments or react to what you said. It was early social media, but the idea was you're sort of communicating back and forth with the people that are interacting with your post, whereas a lot of social media today is sort of passive. This was sort of active. The people that are commenting on 2chan are actively trying to participate in the thing that the original user has posted. And so Hasumi's thinking, why don't I present to Tuchan, to the world of Tuchan, the situation I'm in. Like, I'm in this weird train that has no signage, and it's now coming up on like 30 minutes since we left. It still hasn't stopped. Like, what's going on here? Maybe somebody knows about this train. Like, she didn't know, but she's thinking it's a decent place to try. So Hasumi, she pulls out her phone, she logs into Tuchan, and she's like wondering, like, how am I gonna, frame what's happening here in sort of a simple header to get people's attention? And she comes up with this caption, which was, "This may just be my imagination. Can I post it anyway?" And so she just left that on Tuchan, nothing else, no context yet. And pretty quickly, one other or a couple other Tuchan users noticed it and reacted to it. They said, yeah, please share what's going on with you. And so, sitting there on the train that still is just charging along here, showing no sign of stopping, Hasumi, detailed what was happening and basically asked the internet to be like, what do you think's going on? What do I do? And so initially, a lot of the comments were just like trying to sort of better understand like exactly what train she had gotten onto, at least as she understood it. And like other people were also trying to say like, well, did you look out the window yet? Like, basic stuff. But at some point somebody said, well, hey, why don't you just, go talk to the conductor of the train? Like, just ask them, is this the right train? And when she read that, when Hasumi saw that, she's like, oh my gosh, why didn't I think to do that? I can literally just walk right up there to the front of this train car where the conductor is, knock on the door and be like, hey, what train is this? Why haven't we stopped? Where are we? And so, she put her phone away, she stood up, she walked past all the sleeping passengers on board the train, she goes to the conductor's door, it was shut, and she knocked, and there was no answer. Nobody opened the door. And so eventually she actually tried grabbing the doorknob and tried opening it, but it was locked. And then she called out a few times, like trying to get the conductor's attention because, it's loud outside, but there's no way the conductor wouldn't have heard her if she was yelling. But she yelled a few times and there was just no answer. And so, not really sure what to do because really that's the story of the night so far. She doesn't know what to do. She goes back to her phone and she goes to Tuchan and she just reports what's happening, which is like, okay, I tried the conductor, but apparently there is no conductor, or they're not getting back to me. They're not responding to my knocks or my calls. And so after saying as much on this thread, Hasumi just went and sat down and she's, watching more and more comments populate inside of this thread because this is really gaining traction on Tuchan. People are really interested in what's happening with Hasumi. And at some point, somebody just began saying, hey, just look out the window. Like, seriously, just look out the window and wait. You're gonna see something out there that will give away where you are. Now, Hasumi had obviously been doing that, but she saw that and she's like, okay, I'll just look out the window again. And so she stood up and she walked across to the nearest window. And right as she was about to look out, it was like this whoosh, as suddenly they were inside of a tunnel and it went all black. Like the window went from, she could kind of see outside, it was nighttime, to just complete blackness. They're inside of a tunnel. She can hear the sound of this train clearly going through a tight enclosed space. And it sort of startled her. But then after getting over the sort of initial jump scare of having just entered this tunnel, she realized that, obviously things have gone wrong tonight. Like the train now has been going on for post, 30 minutes at this point. But she knows on her commute to work, at no point did she ever go through a tunnel. Like for sure at this point, she's like on the wrong train. Like there's no two ways about it. But like, great, I'm on the wrong train. Why isn't it stopping? And so Hasumi, she sits back down in her seat and she updates Tuchan about what's going on here, about, the tunnel. And then she's like, you know what? As she's waiting for more answers on this Tuchan thing, she's like, I clearly have to wake somebody up. Like, that's what I have to do. I have to ask, one of these sleeping people what's going on here, because they're on here too. They chose to be on this train. Maybe they know, maybe they know what train this is. So even though she felt really uncomfortable, she got up and she walked over to one of the sleeping passengers, and she was just about to gently shake them awake and ask ask them to help her, when she felt the train slowing down. And she also noticed when she looked up and looked out the window that they were no longer in the tunnel. They were back outside again. So they're slowing down, they're back outside. And she's like, great, we're finally gonna stop. So instead of waking up this passenger, she just walked over to the nearest door, waiting for it to open, and just, waited for the train to come to a stop. And it did. It slowed all the way down. And sure enough, they pulled into this train station. It was an outdoor, uncovered, outdoor train station. And, she had never seen it before. This is like a foreign train station to her. But to her, she's like, I don't care. I'm getting off this train. If I have to, I'll catch another train going back, or I can at least, get my bearings and take a taxi or something. But she knew, like, I need to get off the train. And so once the train had came to a stop, the doors opened up. She stepped off the train onto this small, deserted platform. It's a real train stop, but there's nobody out there. And she's looking up and down the train car, and nobody else is getting off of the train. It's just her, which was odd, because she's thinking, there clearly aren't that many stops that this train makes. This is one of them, and I'm the only one getting off, so that was weird. And so Hasumi, she begins looking around to just see a sign that would tell her, what the name of the station was. And this one actually did have signage. She looked up and she saw that above the banner, or the main stanchion that was the station itself, she saw there was a sign that said Kisaragi. So this was Kisaragi train station, presumably. And she had, never heard of it, but it's like, okay, I have a landmark. And so she's thinking, like, I have no idea where this is. I really don't have a sense of where I am in the country, but okay, I'm in Kisaragi. And what does she do? She goes on 2chan and she updates the forum that, hey, the train finally stopped and I'm at Kisaragi station. I don't know where it is. Can someone tell me where it is? Because, she doesn't really have the ability in 2004, and even with her limited internet access, to do meaningful searches on the internet to figure out where she is. And so she was sort of like outsourcing it. Like, somebody look this up from your home computer and tell me where I am. And so as she's entering this into 2chan, she hears the sound of the doors shutting behind her, and the train begins to take off. And then she looks down at her phone and she sees there's a whole bunch of answers to her most recent comment on 2chan about being at Kisaragi station. And all the people are saying is, there is no Kisaragi station. That station doesn't exist. As soon as she saw that, it was like dread came pouring over her. This whole night has been horrible. And even though the train has slowly begun to pull away, she turned and began running down the platform, yelling for them to stop, like banging on the side of the train, like, don't go anywhere, let me back on. But the train didn't stop, and it just drove off into the night. And so after Hasumi has watched her train disappear, she's left on this dark platform. There's nobody there. There's barely any lights anywhere. And she's terrified. And so what does she do? She pulls her phone out, she goes back to the 2chan thread, and she's hoping that somebody's gonna tell her that, of course, Kisaragi station is real. Of course, there's reasons behind why she got dropped off here. This is fine. But no, she looks at the comments and it's like a flurry of one after the other of everybody telling her, that isn't a real place. People are saying they've looked at train schedules, that their family works for the train line, and they've heard of all the stations. They've never heard of that one. It's one after the other of people saying, you didn't go to Kisaragi station. That's not real. We don't know where you are. This isn't real. And so Hasumi is terrified, and all she knows is she just has to get out of here. She has to go. She doesn't know where, but she has to just go. At the same time this was happening to Hasumi, in the bedroom of an apartment about 20 miles away from the station where Hasumi had first gotten onto the train, a young man named Yuhi was sitting at his computer, frantically refreshing a 2chan page where Hasumi had posted her story. So Yuhi was one of the very first few people who had seen her thread, this could just be my imagination, can I post this here? He had seen that, and he was one of the first few people to start offering up suggestions of what she should do. And he found this to be totally fascinating. I mean, he was on 2chan a lot, and honestly, most of the things people posted on there were not really worth anybody's time. They were sort of boring and sort of redundant, but this felt real. This was frankly exciting. But also, there was a part of Yuhi that was just sort of worried about Hasumi. He didn't know Hasumi at all, but he was invested. He wanted to know what was going on. And also, by the time she had told everyone that she was at Kisaragi station, he was one of the folks who had literally pulled out a map and looked at all the different stations for the train line. And he literally is there is no Kisaragi station. He was one of the people who was really hammering that point home. He was also one of the people that had pointed out that there are several abandoned railway stations that are in Japan that, perhaps there's an old one that, is called Kisaragi Station that has long been forgotten. And, maybe she wound up at that one. But he's thinking, like, why would a commuter train drop off one passenger at an abandoned railway station? Like, that didn't make sense either. And so Yuhi, along with the hundreds and hundreds of other people by now who are commenting on this post, he's in there refreshing over and over again to not just see what other people are suggesting that, Hasumi should try to do to get out of this situation, but he was refreshing to see what Hasumi was doing, because she was providing these updates. And at a certain point, people were telling her, like, hey, you should look for a taxi cab and just take a cab, just get out of there. And then Hasumi commented that there are no taxi cabs out here. Like, there's nobody out here. I've left the station and there's nobody here. Like, there's nothing. And so shortly after that, people are commenting that, you just got to call the police. Like, the police will know where you are. You can describe where you are and they'll know how to get to you. They'll be able to help you. But quickly, those types of comments got buried by this weird growing consensus amongst the many people commenting, which again, at this point is quite a few, like hundreds of people are commenting at this point. There was this growing consensus that basically Hasumi, what she really needs to do is actually get on the train tracks and just walk on the train tracks until you reach the next station. Like, that's what people had sort of defaulted to tell her to do. And Yuhi thought that was potentially quite a bad idea. But it seemed an awful lot like, based on her responses, that she might just do that. In fact, at some point, Hasumi actually said that she was on the tracks and she was walking back the way they came and she was about to enter that tunnel. The tunnel that she had never been in before, the one that had startled her so as they were coming through. Like, she's telling people, I'm walking into that tunnel. And so for Yuhi, and very likely for the other people that were following along, this really was like a real life mystery. It was so exciting. But it was also like, what's going to happen to Hasumi? Like, this is dangerous, what's happening to her. Eventually, as Hasumi got nearer and nearer to this tunnel, her posts on her thread began coming in faster and faster, like one after another. And they got stranger and stranger. At one point, she said that there was some man calling out to her from behind her. But when she turned around and looked, there was nobody there. But then as soon as she went back to looking at the tunnel, there were voices behind her. She also said that at some point she fell and that she was bleeding. And she also commented that she heard bells and she heard drumming that were coming from inside of this tunnel. And so Yuhi and a number of the other 2chan users that were, invested in this thread, when they began hearing these strange things that were coming out of this tunnel, they began messaging her on this post to turn around and just go back to the station. But Hasumi, there was this long pause where she didn't post anything, even though there had been that rapid amount of posting she was doing just a moment ago. It kind of died down for a second. And then she just said, I'm almost to the tunnel. And then it went silent. And so Yuhi waited breathlessly at his keyboard for a very long time until finally Hasumi posted again. And she said that she had successfully made it through this very strange tunnel. She had made it out to the other side, and actually she had found someone who was willing to help her, and that she was going to get into his car and he was going to take her to the next station. However, her situation still didn't sound good. She wrote, my battery's almost run out. Things are getting strange. And then she said, I'm going to make this my last post for now. And then, nothing. There were no more posts from Hasumi. This was around 4 a.m. when she made her last post, which is almost 4 hours from when she made that first post. But she was just gone. In the minutes following Hasumi's final message on 2chan, people all over Japan began calling the police and also representatives at the railway company who ran the train that Hasumi claimed to have been on. They wanted someone to go out and make sure Hasumi was okay. They told the police and they told the railway folks to go to Kisaragi Station, like, go there, she's there, go find her. But everybody said the same thing. Where's Kisaragi Station? What are you talking about? And so ultimately, even though you had like hundreds of people all over the country that were like aware in real time of this girl who was in peril potentially, but nobody can help her. They don't know where she is. They don't know what Kisaragi Station is. And so nobody ever found her. Like, she was just gone. That was it. And so over the next several weeks and months after her disappearance, everybody from 2chan users to the media to, authorities, they were investigating those posts that she had made on 2chan, trying to figure out, really, who is this girl and where had she come from and where had she gone? And so over time, people began to say that, well, then clearly what's happened here is this was a hoax. There is no Hasumi. This was all made up. It was a great fan fiction. And most people accepted that. Except there was a problem. Hasumi was not the last person to experience something like that in Japan. In the years since, at least 7 other people have reported getting on seemingly normal trains and either going past or stopping at a mysterious station where they either find a deserted platform or they encounter bizarre sounds or totally unsettling people. Today, Hasumi's story and all the other accounts of mysterious happenings on Japanese railways are still analyzed and picked apart all across social media and in the news. And people, especially in Japan, remain terrified that this might happen to them every time they board one of those trains. So much so that actually someone developed an actual set of rules for surviving kisaragi or similar deserted mysterious stations in Japan. And these rules were circulated online. And among these rules include you should never respond to anyone who speaks to you, you should avoid going through tunnels, and never exit your train at one of those stations that do not appear on any official maps. Late one night in 1934, a 33-year-old hunter named Harold Young hiked into a very remote village in northern Thailand. Harold had a rifle with him because he was planning to go hunting tonight. However, he knew that before he could actually begin his hunt out in the wilderness here around this village, he first had to get permission from the village chief. So this village and the surrounding area belonged to a small group of indigenous people called the Lahu. So Harold was actually an American citizen, but his parents were missionaries who had raised him and his siblings in Southeast Asia. And so as a result, Harold actually spoke the Lahu language and had a pretty good understanding of their customs. And so he'd actually been to this specific village and gotten permission to hunt from the chief, several times before. So this was relatively routine. However, this night when Harold entered the village, which was made up of, several huts sort of spaced out across this clearing, he noticed right away that the village just seemed different than the last few times that he had been. So, normally there'd be lots of people out and about, moving around sort of at all hours, even late at night. But as he's walking through the village towards the hut that belonged to the chief, it was like nobody was outside. It was eerily quiet, just totally still inside of the village. But, Harold, he really wasn't overly concerned about this. I mean, he just thought, it's weird, it's an anomaly. It is what it is. And so he makes his way towards the back of the village where the chief's hut is, and it was a much more sort of prominent hut. And the front door of the hut was not like a door. This is like a thatch, bamboo style hut, and the door was like a flap of leather. And so Harold, he walks up to the door, and he's about to grab it and sort of pull it aside and call out to the chief to seek permission, when suddenly, as he's reaching for the flap, the chief suddenly appears in the doorway. And the chief, who's this really strong, charismatic guy, he suddenly appears and he looks totally spooked. His eyes are wide, and immediately he recognized Harold because, they've interacted before. But he started looking beyond Harold, into the village that he was in charge of. And he's scanning all around, and he looks at Harold, and in Lahu, in their language, he says to him, you shouldn't be outside right now. And Harold's looking at this chief, thinking how odd it was, considering this guy is a pillar of strength in this village. He's thinking how odd it is that he's acting this way. What could possibly have spooked you this badly? But at the same time, Harold, he understood their customs, but didn't purport to really deeply understand what it was like to be amongst this tribe, to live in this tribe. And so he, again, just sort of wrote off the strangeness, and he's like, oh, hey, I'm just here to go hunting, and I was hoping to get your approval. to go hunting on the outskirts of the village. Am I okay to do that? And he sort of held up his rifle, saying, hey, can I go out there and do it? I'm trying to get your approval. But the chief, he's not really listening to Harold. He's still sort of looking beyond him. And it was pretty clear to Harold that this is going to be a difficult conversation to have. Something's going on here. And Harold, he was about to double down and be like, hey, chief, can I do this or not? And he's about to ask again when suddenly there's this blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream coming from somewhere on the other side of the village. It's coming from one of the other huts on the other side of the village. And Harold, instinctively, he's got his rifle, he's a hunter, he's like, I'm gonna go over there and make sure she's okay. And so he turns and he starts running through the village, having no idea what he's gonna find over there. He's sort of starting to put together how weird this whole night has been. And he's running through the village, what's going on? The scream is sort of stopped, but he could tell roughly where it was coming from. He's running in this direction and he's about to be in sight of the window that looked into the hut where he believes the screaming had come from. And right as he's about to peek his head around, he feels a hand grab him on the shoulder. And it startles Harold, and he whips around, and it's the chief. And the chief, he's still totally spooked. It's he hasn't changed his demeanor. He's still just totally on edge. It was almost like the scream didn't even change anything. This was almost expected in some ways. And he grabs Harold and he looks at him and he just says to him almost in a whisper, be careful and be quiet. And then he kind of stepped back and almost pushed Harold to go look inside of the hut. And so Harold is now genuinely spooked. He has no sense of what he's going to see inside of this hut. But the screaming has stopped, but there's some sort of rustling sound coming from inside of the hut. And he's about to see what it is. And so Harold, with his rifle up, he's totally spooked at this point himself. And he starts walking slowly to look in the window of this hut. And now at this point, the screaming has stopped, but there's clearly rustling noises coming from inside of this hut. Something is in there. And so he walks closer and closer. He's got his rifle up and he peers into the hut. And he sees there's this figure sort of perched on the ground. And its back is to Harold. It's this human-looking figure, but it's covered in fur. It's this dark figure that's crouched down on the ground, and it's moving around it's got something in front of it. And Harold, he doesn't even know what he's looking at. He realizes there is a woman underneath this thing, this creature. This woman is lying on the ground, and she's obviously dead. She's lifeless. She's limp. And as he's staring and his eyes are adjusting to the inside of this hut, he sees there's blood all over the hut. And this creature, it begins to stand up. It was basically crouched over this woman. It stands up, and it's this huge, humanoid creature covered in fur. Its back is still to Harold. And Harold, he's got his rifle up, but he doesn't even know what he's looking at. And then suddenly this thing, it whips around and it looks right at Harold and starts running towards him on its two legs. And Harold reflexively fires a shot and hits it square in the chest. This thing screams out, it's howling, shrieking, a sound he had never heard before, and it falls to the ground, but then it doesn't die. It just whips around, and on all fours, it gallops its way out the back door of the hut, out into the jungle. And so Harold and the chief, they just take off running after this thing, this animal, this creature. They just take off into the wilderness, trying to track it down, because clearly, it must have been wounded, but it isn't dead. It's run off somewhere. And so they're running into the forest. It's dark out, they're running around, but they can clearly see it's going to be really hard to track this thing without light and also without backup. And so the two of them, they're looking at each other oh my goodness. They go back into the village, they round up other people, and they form a search party with torches and more weapons, and then back into the wilderness they go. And quickly they find what appears to be brush that's been sort of smashed down, suggesting this is the direction this large creature had run. And they follow it into the wilderness. And for hours, they're just following what they think is the trail that's going to bring them to this thing. And the whole time, Harold's thinking, I'm a good shot. I know I hit this thing square in the chest. I hit it in the heart. There's no way it lived. I mean, I know I hit it. But where is it? Where did it go? What even happened? And so for hours, they're searching and they can't find it. And ultimately, Harold, he's sort of telling himself and telling the chief and others, it's got to be dead. Whatever it is, it's got to be dead. We can't find it, but I'm sure there's no threat now. And so they go back to the village, And just as a precaution, most of the men that had been a part of the search party, Harold and the chief included, they just stayed out, like by this fire in the middle of the village, and just waited, just in case this thing came back, to just sort of protect the village until the morning. And then eventually, the sun came up, there was light again, and suddenly, like, the atmosphere in the village, although, this is quite tragic what's happened, that woman was mauled to death by whatever this was, but it was clear the creature was gone. But now that it's light out, like, Harold, he was really curious what happened to this thing. Like, he wanted to see what it was. He wanted to confirm that it was dead. And so he, now with the sun up, he walked out in the direction of where that thing had bolted the night before. And as he began following the same trail he had followed the night before, he noticed something. There was a small blood trail that he hadn't seen the night before. Like, there was just no way they could have seen it with their torches. There wasn't enough blood. But now he can see it. And so Harold's like, shoot, I'm gonna see where this goes. I'm gonna find this thing and confirm that it's really dead and figure out what it was. And so he starts following this blood trail, which at first appears to be right in step with the same trail they had been following the night before. But at some point, the blood trail kind of deviated and cut off to the right, where the brush trail, or what they thought was the brush trail, the beaten down brush, sort of continued off into the distance. And it also could have been their own prints from the night before. Like, that continued on, but the blood trail turned and sort of went off in a direction that Harold knew they had not searched the night before. And so Harold's like, shoot, like, okay. And he's following this blood trail, which instead of going deeper into the wilderness, has sort of turned a corner and begins making its way back towards the village itself. And eventually the blood trail brings him all the way back around, back into the village, to the opposite side of the village from where the woman's shack had been. So basically it brought him closer to where the chief's hut was, on that side of the village. And the blood trail sort of turned a corner and literally appeared to go right in one of those flaps that led into one of the huts in the village, a hut that, as far as he knew, nobody had searched for this creature. Why would you? And so Harold's thinking, it's got to still be in here. It probably died inside of this hut. I mean, that's what animals do. They seek shelter when they die. That's got to be what happened. And so Harold, with his rifle, he walks around and he goes to the flap and he opens it up and he looks inside of this hut and he cannot believe what he sees. There was something inside of the hut. There was a man lying on a bed in the back of this hut, and he's covered in blood. His chest is soaked in blood, but it's a man, and he's clearly dead. And the blood trail led, these flames are very intense. The blood trail led from the door right to the bed. And so he's having this like existential crisis. Suddenly he realizes that wasn't an animal, it was a man last night. I shot and apparently killed a man. And so Harold, he goes and gets the chief and he explains how he had found this blood trail. It led him back around. It went to this hut and inside is this man. Clearly there was no animal. It was just this man. He's the one who did this. But Harold's like having this crisis here that he's killed someone. He's killed a person. But the chief, as soon as he walked in and he saw what Harold was showing him, he just put his hand on Harold and he was like, don't worry about it. That's not really a man. So the chief explained to Harold that in their culture, they have this thing called the taw. And the taw is this creature. It's almost like a mythical creature that is reminiscent of a werewolf, where most of the time it takes the form of a normal human. It just acts like a normal human. It would be indistinguishable from a normal human. But periodically and sort of without warning, evil forces can overtake the taw, and it will transform into this hideous, violent, furry, big creature that's, again, sort of like a werewolf, if you will, that then feeds on human flesh. And so on the night that Harold rolled into the village to request permission to go hunting, well, the chief and his villagers, they had seen signs that there could be a taw in the area. It was sort of unclear what tipped it off, but they were fearful that there was a taw out there. And that's why they were all basically hiding indoors. That's why they were so scared when Harold arrived. And the chief couldn't believe that he was out and about at such a dangerous time. And then, obviously the attack happened and that was the taw. Now, whether or not you actually believe that what he encountered was a taw or not, what is the case is that taws, or legends about the taw, can be traced back centuries. And according
Today's video features a story that sounds like it was ripped straight out of a Hollywood survival thriller movie, but I assure you, every single terrifying detail you are about to hear actually happened. And for all you longtime fans of the channel, make sure you pay extra close attention to find that secret image hidden somewhere in today's video. The first person to find the secret image and comment what it is and the timestamp of where it appears in the comment section. I will pin your comment to the very top of the comment section. Also, Old Langy is back again, so make sure you comment your favorite fact he shares with us in today's video. But before we get into it, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is absolutely all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every single week. So if that is of interest to you, please invite the like button over for a fancy, expensive steak dinner, but right before they take their very first bite, abruptly pull the plate away and replace it with a rusty bowl of wet cat food. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you do not miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let us get into today's story. On the morning of Christmas Eve in 1971, a 17-year-old girl named Julianne Kepka was sitting in the bustling, incredibly crowded waiting area of the Jorge Chavez International Airport in Lima, Peru. She was sitting right next to her mother Maria, and the two of them were absolutely buzzing with excitement. Julianne had actually just attended her high school graduation dance the night before she had stayed up late, celebrating with all her friends. And now, she and her mother were heading deep into the Amazon rainforest to spend the Christmas holiday with her father, Hans Wilhelm. Both of Julianne's parents were prominent, highly respected zoologists who ran a remote research station called Panguana, which was completely isolated in the middle of the dense Peruvian jungle. Because her parents spent so much time studying the wildlife out there in the absolute middle of nowhere, Julianne grew up learning all sorts of survival skills and biological facts that most teenagers would never even think about. She practically knew the jungle just as well as she knew the paved streets of Lima. But on this particular day, they were not hacking through the brush, they were taking a commercial flight to get back to the station. They boarded Lanza Flight 508, which was a turboprop airliner, and the mood inside the cabin was incredibly festive. There were 92 people on board, and passengers were bringing brightly wrapped Christmas presents, chatting loudly across the aisles, and looking forward to the holiday weekend. Julianne was wearing a very simple sleeveless mini dress and a pair of white sandals, just totally relaxed. As the plane took off and began its ascent over the massive snow-capped Andes Mountains, everything seemed perfectly normal. The flight attendants were moving up and down the aisles, serving sandwiches and drinks, and Julianne was just casually looking out the window at the lush green canopy of the Amazon, stretching out as far as the eye could see. But about 40 minutes into the flight, the sky outside the window began to change very rapidly. The bright, beautiful midday sun was suddenly swallowed up by massive, pitch-black storm clouds. The cabin grew incredibly dark, almost like it was the middle of the night, and the plane began to violently shake. And this was not just normal turbulence, it felt like the aircraft was being thrown around by a giant invisible hand. The shaking got so bad that luggage started popping right out of the overhead bins, raining down on the terrified passengers below. Christmas presents, heavy wrapped boxes, and duffel bags were flying everywhere, striking people in the head and shoulders. People started screaming, crying, and praying out loud. Julianne's mother, who was usually a very calm, rational, and completely fearless scientist, gripped the armrest of her seat so tightly that her knuckles turned bright white, and she leaned over and quietly said to Julianne that she did not like this at all. The turbulence grew so severe that the plane was dropping hundreds of feet in a matter of seconds, leaving everyone's stomachs up in their throats. And then, at an altitude of about 10,000 feet, which is roughly 3,000 meters up in the air, a massive, blinding bolt of lightning struck the right wing of the plane. The lightning strike directly hit a fuel tank, and instantly a terrifying flash of white light illuminated the entire cabin, followed by a deafening, earth-shattering explosion. Julianne's mother turned to her, her face completely pale, and simply said, "That is the end. Everything is over." Those were the very last words Julianne ever heard her mother speak. Because in the very next second, the plane literally tore apart in midair. The cabin split wide open, ripping the metal fuselage to shreds, and the deafening roar of the jet engines was entirely replaced by the violent rushing sound of freezing wind. Julianne was suddenly sucked right out of the plane and into the open sky. She was still firmly strapped into her row of 3 seats, but the plane around her was just completely gone. She was in a terrifying, completely uncontrollable freefall, plummeting 3,000 meters down toward the unforgiving canopy of the Amazon jungle. The row of seats she was attached to began to spin rapidly like the blades of a helicopter, violently twirling her through the dense freezing storm clouds. The wind was roaring in her ears, the rain was whipping against her face like little needles, and the G-force of the spinning seats was so incredibly intense that the blood rushed from her head and she quickly lost consciousness, blacking out, while still falling through the sky. When Julianne finally opened her eyes again, it was the morning of Christmas Day. She was completely alone, lying face down in the deep, wet mud of the jungle floor. She was utterly disoriented, concussed, and in a state of severe medical shock. The torrential rain was pouring down on her back, and as she slowly, agonizingly pushed herself up out of the mud, she realized that the row of seats she was strapped to had somehow miraculously cushioned her fall. It had acted almost like a makeshift parachute as it crashed through the thick network of vines and branches before violently slamming into the soft mud. But she was far from uninjured. Her collarbone was completely broken, she had deep bleeding gashes on her arms and legs, one of her knee ligaments was torn, and her right eye was swollen completely shut from the impact. To make matters even worse, she was still only wearing that thin, sleeveless mini dress, which was now torn to shreds, and she had lost her eyeglasses during the terrifying fall. Julianne was severely nearsighted, so without her glasses, the entire jungle around her was just a massive, blurry, highly dangerous green maze. She also only had one of her white sandals left. Most people in this horrifying situation would have simply sat down in the mud, cried, and waited to die. The pain from her broken collarbone was excruciating with every breath she took, and the sheer vastness of the Amazon is enough to break anyone's spirit. But as Julianne sat there shivering in the mud, she remembered a crucial life-saving piece of advice her father had drilled into her head years ago. He had told her that if she ever got lost in the jungle, she needed to find a small stream of flowing water and follow it downstream. A small stream will always eventually lead to a larger river, and a larger river will always eventually lead to human civilization. So, running on pure adrenaline terror and an unbreakable survival instinct, she forced herself to stand up and began to walk. The Amazon rainforest is easily one of the most hostile and unforgiving environments on the entire planet. It is absolutely crawling with venomous snakes, jaguars, aggressive wild pigs, and poisonous frogs. Because she could not see well without her glasses, she used her one remaining sandal to constantly test the ground in front of her, poking the mud and the thick layer of dead leaves with every single step to make sure she did not accidentally step on a deadly pit viper. She walked for days in total isolation, fighting through the oppressive, suffocating heat, the constant maddening swarms of mosquitoes that bit every inch of her exposed skin, and the relentless torrential rain that kept her constantly freezing and wet. She had absolutely no food whatsoever. The only thing she had managed to find at the crash site was a small crushed bag of candy, which she very carefully rationed out over the first few days, eating just one piece a day. Once the candy was gone, she had nothing. She drank dirty, muddy water straight from the streams to stay hydrated, often wading waist-deep through the murky water while trying to frantically avoid stepping on hidden stingrays or caimans that were lurking just beneath the surface. The nights were the absolute worst. It would get pitch black in the jungle, and she would have to huddle under tree roots, listening to the terrifying sounds of predators moving through the brush around her, completely unable to sleep due to the freezing cold and the agonizing pain of her broken bones. By the 9th day of her grueling, seemingly endless trek, Julianne's body was rapidly shutting down. She was starving to death, severely dehydrated, and her open wounds were badly infected from the dirty water and the constant exposure to the elements. But the most horrifying, nightmarish issue of all was a deep, open gash on her right arm. A few days earlier, while she was sleeping, a botfly had landed directly on her open wound and laid its eggs deep inside her exposed flesh. Now, those eggs had hatched. As Julianne walked, she could physically feel dozens of large, thick maggots wriggling and squirming deep underneath her skin, literally eating her alive from the inside out. The pain was sharp and excruciating, and it sent waves of intense nausea through her entire body. She knew from her parents' scientific teachings. that if she did not get those maggots out of her arm immediately, her flesh would rot, her arm would turn gangrenous, and she would quickly die of a massive blood infection. Later that afternoon, on the 10th day of her nightmare, as she was stumbling heavily along the muddy edge of a wide river, practically hallucinating from the starvation and exhaustion, she spotted something through her blurry vision, stopped her dead in her tracks. It was a small wooden boat securely tied to a tree on the riverbank, and just up a small muddy hill nearby, there was a tiny open-faced logging hut with a roof made of palm leaves. She dragged her battered, failing body up the hill to the hut, desperately praying to find someone inside, but it was totally empty. The loggers were nowhere to be found. However, sitting in the corner of this little dirt floor shelter was a small plastic jerry can. She dragged herself over to it, her hands shaking violently, and unscrewed the cap. The incredibly strong, distinct fumes hit her face immediately. It was full of gasoline. Instantly, a very specific memory flashed in her exhausted mind. She remembered a time back at the research station when the family dog had gotten a horrible maggot infection in its paw, and her father had used highly toxic kerosene to draw the parasites out of the wound. Knowing she had absolutely no other choice and that her life depended on it, Julianne sat down heavily on the dirt floor, grabbed the heavy plastic can, and poured the harsh, toxic gasoline directly into the open, gaping, maggot-infested wound on her right arm. The very second the raw fuel hit her exposed flesh and seeped deep into the cuts, the pain was so blinding and intensely agonizing that she immediately began vomiting uncontrollably onto the floor. It felt like someone had plunged a red-hot glowing iron knife straight into her arm and left it there. Her vision went entirely white, and she nearly passed out from the sheer shock of the pain. But she bit her lip until it bled, forcing herself to stay awake, and she watched in sheer horror as the fat white maggots suffocating from the toxic gasoline pouring into their environment began to actively squirm and stick their heads up out of her skin to try and get air. Trembling in agony, using her dirty, mud-caked fingernails, Julianne painstakingly plucked over 30 squirming maggots out of her own flesh, one by one, tossing them onto the dirt floor until the wound was finally completely clear. Totally exhausted, traumatized, and violently shaking from the residual pain, she collapsed right there on the floor of the hut and immediately fell into a deep sleep. The very next morning, 3 local Peruvian loggers arrived back at their camp and were absolutely terrified to find a pale, bloody, severely emaciated young girl lying motionless on the floor of their hut. At first, they actually thought she was a mythical water spirit from local river folklore. But Julianne weakly opened her eyes and spoke to them in fluent Spanish, explaining that she was a passenger from the airplane that had crashed in the storm. The loggers were totally stunned. They quickly cleaned her wounds, fed her some sugar and food, and loaded her into their boat, transporting her several hours down the river to a local lumber town where she was airlifted to a hospital. There she was, finally reunited with her completely astounded and heartbroken father, who had believed he lost his entire family. It turned out that a massive international search and rescue operation had been combing the jungle for over a week, but they had eventually completely given up and called off the search because the incredibly thick jungle canopy made it entirely impossible to spot the plane wreckage from the air. Nobody in their right mind could have ever possibly imagined that a 17-year-old girl could fall 3,000 meters out of the sky and survive the impact and then independently navigate her way out of the deadly Amazon rainforest all on her own. Out of the 92 passengers and crew members on board Qantas Flight 508, Julianne Kurchenko was the sole survivor. The airline, facing massive public outrage and ongoing safety issues, actually lost its operating license and completely shut down just weeks later. The overwhelming, pungent smell of raw gasoline and rotting flesh slowly fades into the humid, salty air of an isolated rocky island. A place where the fight for survival is no longer a desperate battle against the unforgiving forces of nature, but rather a chilling, calculated war against the very people who brought you there. In the year 1968, the South Korean Central Intelligence Agency began quietly scouring the darkest corners of their own country. They were looking through the worst prisons, the most dangerous back alleys, and the underground criminal syndicates for a very specific type of person. They needed men who had absolutely nothing to lose, men who were violent, desperate, and completely expendable. Ultimately, they handpicked 31 young men. Many of these guys were petty criminals, street thugs, and vagrants. The agents approached these men with a highly unusual proposition. They told them that they could either rot in a filthy jail cell or live on the streets for the rest of their lives, or they could serve their country on a top-secret Black Ops mission. If they survived and completed this mission, their criminal records would be entirely wiped clean, they would be given a substantial amount of money, and they would return to society as national heroes. It was an offer practically none of them could refuse. So all 31 men agreed. They were blindfolded, loaded onto a series of military transports, and taken out to sea under the cover of darkness. When the blindfolds were finally removed, the men found themselves standing on the rocky, barren shores of Silmido. Silmido was a tiny, completely uninhabited, heavily forested island floating in the Yellow Sea off the western coast of South Korea. It was an incredibly desolate place, characterized by jagged cliffs and aggressive, unpredictable ocean tides. The moment these men stepped off the boat onto the sand, their civilian identities were completely erased from all official government records. They were no longer citizens, they were now officially known only as Unit 684. And the mission they had been recruited for was finally revealed to them by their heavily armed military commanders. Their objective was to secretly infiltrate the heavily fortified capital of North Korea, breach the presidential palace, and assassinate the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung. To prepare them for what was essentially a suicide mission, the commanders subjected the men of Unit 684 to a training regimen that can only be described as absolute hell on earth. The military did not want traditional soldiers, they wanted heartless, unbreakable killing machines. And so the physical and psychological abuse began immediately. The men were forced to endure grueling marches across the jagged rocks, carrying massive, heavy tree logs on their shoulders until their skin literally peeled away and their muscles gave out. If a man stumbled or fell to the ground out of exhaustion, the instructors would mercilessly beat them with wooden clubs and heavy rifle butts until they stood back up. But the physical exhaustion was only the beginning. To completely strip away their humanity and harden them for the horrors of their mission, the commanders forced the men to survive off the unforgiving land in the most brutal ways imaginable. During the early months of their training, the men were routinely starved. To survive, they were ordered to hunt down venomous snakes in the brush and eat them completely raw, tearing the reptiles apart with their bare hands. They were forced to catch wild disease-ridden rats that scurried around the camp. And the commanders would actually make the men bite the heads off the live rodents before eating them. It was psychological torture specifically designed to break their minds and rebuild them as apex predators. This unimaginable level of stress and violence took a massive toll on the recruits. Over the next 3 years, the island of Silmido claimed the lives of 7 of the men. Some of them drowned in the freezing, turbulent ocean during grueling open water swimming exercises. Others simply dropped dead from sheer physical exhaustion and the relentless daily beatings. A few who tried to resist the training or escape the island were executed on the spot as a terrifying example to the rest. By the time the training was over, only 24 men remained. But these 24 men had been completely transformed. They were no longer the disorganized street thugs that had arrived on the boat years earlier. They were highly lethal, incredibly proficient weapons of war, completely ready to cross the border and execute their mission without hesitation. But they never got the chance. By 1971, the geopolitical landscape in Asia had drastically shifted. The intense hostility between North and South Korea began to temporarily cool down, and the two nations quietly started holding diplomatic peace talks. Suddenly, sending a highly trained Black Ops death squad across the border to violently murder the North Korean leader was no longer a viable political strategy. It would instantly spark an all-out war and completely destroy the fragile peace process. So, the South Korean government quietly and officially canceled the assassination mission. But this created a massive immediate problem. Unit 684 was a top-secret, strictly off-the-books operation. The government could not simply bring these 24 highly trained, incredibly traumatized, undocumented killers back to the mainland and release them into the general public. They were a massive political liability. They knew way too much, and they had been trained to be far too dangerous. So, the government made a chilling decision. They decided to just leave them on the island and pretend they did not exist. For months, the men of Unit 684 languished on Silmido. The funding for their camp completely dried up. Their food rations were severely cut back to almost nothing. The harsh winter slowly turned into a brutal, sweltering summer, and the men realized they were essentially trapped in a prison camp they had helped build. But things were about to get infinitely worse. The military brass back on the mainland eventually realized that simply starving them out was not enough. They needed the dark secret of Silmido completely buried forever. So a top-secret order was transmitted to the military guards stationed on the island. The order was simple and absolute. The guards were instructed to quietly execute every single remaining member of Unit 684, burn their bodies, and completely destroy the camp to erase any physical evidence that it ever existed. But the government severely underestimated the very monsters they had spent 3 years creating. You cannot easily hide a plot to assassinate assassins. The men of Unit 684 were hyper-observant, highly paranoid, and explicitly trained in reading enemy behavior. They noticed the subtle, nervous shifts in the guards' demeanor, they noticed the extra weapons being prepped, and the hushed, secretive conversations happening just out of earshot. Whether they overheard a sloppy radio transmission or simply deduced what was coming based on the changing atmosphere, the 24 men realized that the country they had bled for, the country that had promised them freedom and glory, was about to slaughter them like animals. And they decided they were absolutely not going to sit around and wait to be executed. In the pitch-black, early morning hours of the 23rd of August, 1971, the 24 phantoms of Unit 684 silently rose from their beds. They knew the layout of the camp perfectly, and they had memorized the exact timing of the guard rotations. Because their personal firearms were kept locked up by the military, they had to improvise. Moving like shadows through the dark, the men slipped into the camp's tool sheds and crept along the rocky beaches. They armed themselves with heavy iron sledgehammers, thick wooden clubs, and massive jagged boulders. They then crept up to the barracks where the military guards were fast asleep in their bunks. Without making a single sound, they infiltrated the sleeping quarters. What followed was a staggering display of silent, unadulterated brutality. The men of Unit 684 used the heavy sledgehammers and the massive beach rocks to completely crush the skulls of the sleeping guards. The violence was swift, precise, and completely merciless. In a matter of minutes 18, heavily armed military guards were brutally beaten to death in their beds before they could even sound an alarm or reach for their weapons. Having successfully neutralized the camp's security force, the mutineers immediately broke into the island's main armory. They geared up, loading themselves down with assault rifles, sidearms, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and heavy crates of high-explosive fragmentation grenades. They then stormed down to the shoreline, hijacked a small coastal vessel, and navigated away from the hellish island of Silmido, making their way straight toward the mainland. They made landfall at the port city of Incheon, which was just west of the capital city of Seoul. These 24 men were completely consumed by rage and a profound, blinding sense of betrayal. They did not just want to escape into the countryside, they wanted answers. Their plan was to march directly on the Blue House, which is the South Korean presidential residence in Seoul, and violently demand an explanation from the government that had condemned them to die. Upon landing in Incheon, they stormed onto a nearby road and aggressively flagged down a civilian passenger bus. Heavily armed, covered in blood, dirt, and wearing stolen military fatigues, they swarmed onto the vehicle, terrifying the civilian passengers inside. They pointed their rifles at the driver's head and ordered him to step on the gas and drive straight to the capital. But the military command had already been alerted to the horrific bloodbath back on Silmido. Total panic set in at the highest levels of the government. They absolutely could not allow a bus full of highly trained, heavily armed rogue assassins to breach the capital city. So the military and local police rapidly mobilized, setting up massive, heavily fortified roadblocks along the major highway leading directly into Seoul. As the hijacked bus came tearing down the highway, it rapidly approached the very first blockade. Instead of slowing down, the driver with the gun pressed firmly to the back of his head, smashed right through the wooden barricades as the men of Unit 684 leaned out the windows and opened fire. A massive, terrifying rolling shootout ensued on the civilian highway. The assassins smashed out all the glass windows of the bus and began firing wildly at the police and military vehicles, pursuing them, pulling the pins on live grenades and tossing them out the windows. The explosives detonated violently on the asphalt, sending deadly shrapnel and police cars flying into the air. Sirens were blaring, tires were screeching, and the sheer volume of automatic gunfire was totally deafening. But the military response was overwhelmingly massive. As the bus finally pushed its way into the outer neighborhoods of Seoul, it was met by hundreds of heavily armed soldiers and armored military vehicles. The soldiers unleashed a massive, coordinated barrage of concentrated fire directly at the bus. Bullets ripped through the thin metal paneling, shattering the remaining glass and completely destroying the engine block. The bus ground to a violent smoking halt in the middle of a massive city boulevard, completely surrounded by an impenetrable wall of armed soldiers. Inside the bus, the situation was utterly hopeless. Several members of Unit 684 had already been shot and killed in the intense firefight. They were completely outgunned, rapidly running out of ammunition, and bleeding heavily onto the floor of the bus. They knew their mission to reach the president was over, and they knew that if they surrendered, they would simply be taken to a black site, brutally tortured, and executed in secret anyway. They looked at each other, silently acknowledging that they would much rather die right there on their own terms than give the government the satisfaction of killing them. In a final horrific act of absolute defiance, the surviving members of Unit 684 collectively reached down to their tactical vests. They pulled the pins on their remaining high-explosive grenades, held them tight against their own chests, and waited. A split second later, a massive, deafening series of explosions ripped the bus apart from the inside out. A huge fireball erupted into the sky, blowing the roof completely off the bus and sending jagged, burning shrapnel flying in every direction. The bus was instantly engulfed in a roaring, unstoppable inferno. Out of the 24 men who had escaped Silmido that morning, 20 of them died instantly in that horrific blast. When the thick black smoke finally cleared and the soldiers cautiously approached the smoldering, twisted wreckage of the bus, they found 4 members of Unit 684 who had miraculously survived the explosion, though they were incredibly, severely injured and clinging to life. The government immediately swept in to control the narrative and hide their dark secret. They completely covered up the existence of Unit 684, telling the terrified public via emergency national news broadcasts that the men on the burning bus were actually highly dangerous North Korean communist spies who had attempted to violently infiltrate the country. It was a massive, heavily orchestrated lie that the government would successfully maintain for several decades. As for the 4 badly burned and injured survivors, they were quietly dragged away to a secret military hospital, patched up just enough to stand on their own 2 feet, and then placed in front of a completely secret military tribunal. They were found guilty of mutiny and treason against the state. In 1972, all 4 of them were quietly executed by a military firing squad. To this very day, the South Korean government has never disclosed the location where those 4 men were buried, leaving the final resting place of Unit 684 a complete mystery. The deafening roar of the grenades exploding inside that burning bus slowly gives way to the absolute suffocating silence inside the passenger cabin of a commercial airliner cruising high above the Pacific Ocean. A silence that is just about to be torn apart by an invisible threat. On the afternoon of May 26, 1971, a receptionist sitting at her desk inside the busy switchboard room at the Qantas Airlines headquarters in Sydney, Australia, reached out and answered a ringing telephone. She had been taking routine calls all day, mostly from people looking to book tickets or check flight times, so she expected this call to be exactly the same. She politely said hello and waited for a response. But the person on the other end of the line did not ask about a flight. Instead, a male voice with a slight, very calm English accent spoke up and simply said that his name was Mr. Brown and he was calling to inform Qantas that there was a bomb currently hidden on board Qantas Flight 755. At first, the receptionist completely froze. She thought maybe this was some kind of horrible prank. But the man did not laugh, and he did not sound crazy. He sounded incredibly professional, almost like he was just reading the daily weather report. He went on to explain in terrifyingly precise technical detail that the explosive device on the plane was connected to a barometric pressure switch, which is essentially an altimeter that measures the aircraft's altitude. He told the receptionist that the bomb was already armed, and if the pilot attempted to lower the aircraft to an altitude below 20,000 feet, the change in air pressure would immediately trigger the detonator and the entire plane would violently explode in midair. Now, for context, Qantas Flight 755 was a massive Boeing 707 commercial airliner that had just taken off from Sydney a short time earlier, and it was currently climbing up to its cruising altitude on its way to Hong Kong. There were 128 passengers and crew members on board. At this exact moment up in the sky, the passengers were completely blissfully unaware of anything being wrong. People were settling into their seats, taking off their shoes, reading the daily newspaper, and chatting with their seatmates, while the flight attendants began rolling the beverage carts down the narrow aisles. It was just a perfectly normal, quiet afternoon flight over the massive expanse of the Pacific Ocean. But down on the ground, absolute sheer panic was beginning to set in. The receptionist immediately alerted her managers, who then frantically contacted the police and the senior executives of Qantas Airlines. Everyone wanted to believe that this Mr. Brown character was just a scammer making an empty threat, but they could not afford to take that chance with over 100 lives on the line. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang again at the Qantas headquarters, and it was Mr. Brown. He knew that the airline officials were probably doubting his story, so he told them that if they wanted proof that his bomb was real, they needed to immediately send someone to the Kingsford Smith Airport in Sydney and open public storage. Locker number 84. He said that inside that specific locker, they would find a sample bomb that was built exactly the same way as the one currently sitting on Flight 755. After saying this, Mr. Brown abruptly hung up the phone. The Qantas executives immediately dispatched a heavily armed police bomb squad to the airport. The officers sprinted through the busy airport terminal, pushing past confused travelers until they reached the banks of public storage lockers. They located locker number 84, carefully picked the lock, and slowly opened the metal door. Inside, they found a very ordinary-looking package wrapped in old newspaper. But when the bomb technicians carefully peeled back the layers of paper, they all simultaneously broke into a cold sweat. Inside the package was a fully functional, highly sophisticated explosive device. It was made out of thick sticks of gelignite, which is a very powerful explosive, and it was wired directly to a heavy-duty battery and a commercial altimeter. The bomb squad commander took one look at the device and immediately called the Qantas executives. He told them that this was not a hoax. The bomb maker was clearly an absolute professional. The wiring was flawless, and if a device exactly like this one was currently on that plane, it would absolutely destroy the aircraft the second it dropped below 20,000 feet. With the threat now completely validated, the Qantas executives desperately radioed the cockpit of Flight 755. Up in the air, the pilot and the co-pilot were just calmly monitoring their instruments when the radio suddenly cracked to life. The ground controller, trying his best to keep the utter terror out of his voice, informed the captain that there was a live altitude-triggered bomb somewhere on their aircraft. The controller explicitly ordered the captain to maintain an altitude well above 20,000 feet at all costs and to immediately turn the massive plane around and begin flying in large, slow circles over the Pacific Ocean just off the coast of Sydney. Inside the cockpit, the blood completely drained from the pilots' faces. They looked at their altimeter gauge, which read roughly 30,000 feet, and realized that they were essentially trapped in the sky. They could not go down, and eventually their massive jet would completely run out of fuel, and they would fall out of the sky anyway. But because they were professionals, the pilots did not panic. They quietly turned the plane around and began flying in endless, agonizing loops over the ocean. And amazingly, they decided not to tell the passengers what was going on. They just casually announced over the intercom that they were experiencing a minor mechanical issue and had to burn off some extra fuel before returning to Sydney. So, while the passengers continued to happily eat their lunches and drink their tea, completely oblivious to the situation, the pilots sat in the cockpit sweating profusely, constantly watching the fuel gauge slowly drop lower and lower. Back on the ground, Mr. Brown called Qantas for a third time. Now that he had their undivided attention, he finally laid out his demands. He told the airline executives that if they wanted to know exactly where the bomb was hidden on the plane so it could be safely disarmed, they had to pay him a ransom of 500,000 Australian dollars. And he was incredibly specific about how he wanted the money. He demanded that the entire $500,000 be paid exclusively in used non-sequential $20 banknotes. He then gave them a strict time limit and hung up. The general manager of Qantas and the local police commissioner quickly realized they had absolutely no other choice. They had to pay this guy, or 128 people were going to die. But gathering $500,000 in old $20 bills in 1971 was an absolute logistical nightmare. Qantas officials had to frantically contact the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and bank tellers all across the city were ordered to drop whatever they were doing and start emptying their vaults. It took hours of frantic, non-stop counting, but eventually the bank managed to pool together 25,000 individual $20 bills. Because it was so much physical paper, the money weighed roughly 30 kilograms or about 65 pounds. The bank clerks stuffed all this cash into two massive heavy leather suitcases and handed them over to a senior Qantas official. What followed was an incredibly tense, high-stakes game of cat and mouse across the streets of Sydney. Mr. Brown kept calling the Qantas switchboard, giving the official driving the van with the money a series of cryptic turn-by-turn directions. He would order the driver to go to a specific public payphone, wait for it to ring, and then receive the next set of instructions. The police were trying desperately to trace the calls, but Mr. Brown was moving too fast and keeping the calls too short. Finally, after driving all over the city, the driver was ordered to pull up in front of a specific building in the heart of Sydney, take the two massive heavy suitcases out of the van, leave them right on the sidewalk, and drive away. Immediately. The official did exactly as he was told. He dropped the bags and sped off. A few moments later, an unidentified man stepped out of the shadows, casually picked up the two insanely heavy suitcases containing $500,000 and simply melted away into the bustling city streets without a single police officer spotting him. Back at Qantas headquarters, the executives and the police waited in total agonizing silence. The plane, flying in circles over the ocean, was now running dangerously low on fuel. The captain had radioed down, saying that if they did not get clearance to descend soon, the engines would literally stall out and they would plummet into the ocean. The tension in the control room was completely unbearable. Then finally, the phone rang. It was Mr. Brown. He calmly confirmed that he had received the money, and then he delivered the news they had all been praying for. He said there was absolutely no bomb on the plane, it was entirely a bluff. The Qantas executives immediately radioed the cockpit of Flight 755 and told the captain that the threat was clear. The pilots, breathing the heaviest sighs of relief of their entire lives, gently pushed the yoke forward and began their descent. As the plane crossed the 20,000-foot threshold, the pilots braced themselves just in case Mr. Brown was lying. But nothing happened. The plane continued its descent and eventually landed completely safely on the runway in Sydney. When the passengers finally disembarked, they still had absolutely no idea that they had just been at the center of one of the most terrifying aviation hostage situations in history. They just complained about the delay and went home. Mr. Brown had just successfully pulled off what appeared to be the absolute perfect crime. He had extorted $500,000 from a major airline without ever firing a single bullet, without ever physically taking a hostage, and in fact, without ever even putting a real bomb on the actual plane. The police had zero leads, zero suspects, and it seemed like Mr. Brown was going to completely get away with it. And he absolutely would have if he had not turned out to be one of the dumbest criminals to ever live. The man known as Mr. Brown was actually a local petty criminal named Peter Macari. After picking up the suitcases full of cash, Macari essentially had it made. All he had to do was lay low, keep his mouth shut, and slowly spend the money over the course of several years so he would not attract any attention. But Macari simply could not help himself. Just a few short months after the incredibly high-profile heist, which was still dominating every single news headline in the country, Macari walked into a high-end car dealership in Sydney. He pointed at a brand new, incredibly flashy, bright muscle car, a Ford Falcon GTHO, and told the salesman he wanted to buy it on the spot. When it came time to pay, Macari casually dropped a massive stack of old, used $20 bills on the sales manager's desk. And to make matters exponentially worse, when he was filling out the registration paperwork for his incredibly conspicuous new sports car, Macari actually wrote down his real legal name and his actual home address. The car salesman, obviously highly suspicious of a guy paying for a luxury vehicle with thousands of used $20 bills right after the biggest $20 bill robbery in Australian history, immediately called the police. The authorities quickly raided Macari's home and placed him under arrest. He was eventually tried, convicted, and sentenced to 15 years in prison for his role in the extortion plot, completely destroying his own perfect crime through sheer unbelievable stupidity. And while the police did manage to recover a large portion of the stolen money that Macari had stashed away in various hiding spots, roughly $137,000 of the ransom money was never found. And to this day, it remains completely missing without a trace. From a supposed mastermind, criminal designing an elaborate airborne heist, but failing completely and miserably the moment he touched the ground, the image shifts to a group of robbers acting directly on the ground, but pulling off their crime dressed as elegantly as high society VIPs stepping out onto a red carpet. At 3:50 a.m. on the morning of January 2nd, 1972, the freezing wind swept streets of Manhattan and New York City were almost completely dead. The massive, extravagant New Year's Eve parties that had gripped the city just a day earlier were officially over, and practically everyone was at home fast asleep in their warm beds. On the corner of 5th Avenue and 61st Street stood the Pierre Hotel. The Pierre was not just a regular place to stay. It was widely considered to be one of the most incredibly luxurious, highly exclusive, and unbelievably expensive hotels in the entire world. This was the exact kind of place where international royalty, massive Hollywood movie stars, and incredibly wealthy corporate tycoons would stay when they were doing business in the city. And because these ultra-wealthy individuals would routinely travel with millions of dollars in cash and priceless family jewels, the Pierre Hotel featured a massive, highly fortified underground vault filled with private safe deposit boxes to keep their belongings secure. Inside the brilliantly lit, incredibly opulent lobby of the hotel, the small night shift staff was just going about their very quiet, totally routine early morning duties. The night manager was standing behind the heavy front desk, looking over the guest ledger. A few bellhops were leaning against the marble pillars, trying their best to stay awake, and the armed security guards were casually making their rounds. Sipping hot coffee to fight off the winter chill? It was the absolute dead of night, and absolutely nobody was expecting any sort of VIP arrivals. But then, a massive, sleek, completely black Cadillac limousine slowly rolled up the circular driveway and parked right outside the main glass doors of the hotel lobby. The massive engine sat there quietly idling, and thick white exhaust poured out into the freezing night air. A moment later, the rear doors of the limo opened, and 4 men stepped out onto the pavement. They were dressed absolutely impeccably. They were wearing tailored, high-end black tuxedos with crisp white shirts and black bow ties, looking exactly like a group of incredibly wealthy socialites who were just returning from some lavish all-night high society gala. They calmly walked up to the heavy glass doors, pushed them open, and strolled right into the brightly lit lobby. Their shiny dress shoes clicking loudly against the polished marble floor, the hotel staff immediately looked up, putting on their best customer service, smiles completely, ready to assist these high-rolling guests. But as the 4 men got closer to the front desk, the night manager and the bellhops suddenly noticed something incredibly unsettling about their faces. All 4 of the men were wearing these highly realistic, but still noticeably fake rubber noses. They were also wearing very stiff, incredibly unnatural-looking wigs and large dark glasses. It gave them this incredibly eerie, almost mannequin-like appearance. And before the night manager could even open his mouth to ask how he could help them, the 4 men in tuxedos simultaneously reached inside their tailored jackets and pulled out heavy, fully loaded handguns. Without raising their voices, without screaming, and without causing any sort of massive, chaotic commotion, the men quickly and systematically took total control of the entire lobby. The leader of the group, a highly experienced, incredibly bold, and very dangerous career criminal named Samuel Nallo, stepped forward. Nallo was a notorious mafia associate who specialized in massive high-stakes burglaries, and he had completely masterminded this entire operation. With a very calm, terrifyingly cold voice, Nallo ordered his men to fan out and round up every single employee on the floor. Working with absolute military precision, the robbers moved rapidly through the lobby and the adjoining hallways, pointing their weapons at the terrified staff. They quickly gathered up all 19 of the hotel employees, including the armed security guards, who were completely caught off guard by the sudden, silent ambush and were immediately stripped of their weapons. The robbers did not yell, they did not physically beat anybody, and they did not fire a single shot. They just quietly marched all 19 hostages down a long carpeted corridor and shoved them into a large, secure holding room located deep inside the back offices of the hotel. Once inside, they ordered the terrified employees to sit down on the floor. The robbers then produced heavy metal handcuffs and proceeded to secure the hostages directly to the thick metal plumbing pipes running along the walls of the room. The hostages were absolutely trembling, fully expecting to be brutally executed right then and there to eliminate any witnesses, but Nalo just looked down at them and calmly told them to sit tight, stay completely quiet, and absolutely nobody would get hurt. Nalo and his right-hand man, a highly skilled thief named Robert Comfort, then walked out of the room, leaving one of their armed associates to stand guard by the door. Comfort reached into his heavy duffel bag and pulled out a police frequency radio scanner, turning it on and carefully tuning it to the local NYPD dispatch channels. They wanted to make absolutely sure that no passing patrol cars had noticed the idling limousine outside or the hostile takeover of the lobby. Once they were totally satisfied that the coast was clear and the police had no idea what was going on, Nalo and Comfort pulled out a heavy ring of keys and a highly detailed, incredibly accurate blueprint of the hotel's underground vault. Now, the only reason these guys had this highly classified information and the only reason they knew exactly how to bypass the hotel's massive security systems was because a few months earlier, the Pierre Hotel had fired one of their senior security guards. That very angry, highly disgruntled former employee had gone straight into the criminal underworld and sold the hotel's deepest, darkest security secrets to Nalo and his crew. Using the stolen keys and the blueprints, the robbers made their way down into the massive, highly fortified basement of the hotel. They easily bypassed the heavy steel vault doors and stepped into the main safe deposit room, which housed hundreds of private boxes belonging to the hotel's ultra-wealthy guests. For the next 2.5 hours, while the entire city of New York slept completely unaware, and the 19 hostages sat terrified and handcuffed to the plumbing pipes, the 4 men in tuxedos went to work. They did not just randomly break open boxes. Because of the insider information they had purchased, they knew exactly which specific safe deposit boxes held the absolute most valuable items. They casually and methodically used heavy power drills, steel pry bars, and specialized lockpicking tools to crack open one thick metal box after another. The haul was absolutely staggering. They were pulling out massive, heavy canvas bags and completely stuffing them full of thick banded stacks of $100 bills. They grabbed incredibly rare, flawless diamonds the size of walnuts, solid gold Rolex, watches, massive ruby necklaces, and absolutely priceless family heirlooms that had been passed down for generations. They were completely stripping the vault bare of its most valuable contents. By the time they finally stopped drilling and prying, they had successfully completely cleared out an unbelievable $27 million worth of untraceable cash and jewelry, which instantly made this the largest and most successful hotel robbery in world history at that time. By now, it was rapidly approaching 6 in the morning, and Nalo knew that the morning shift staff would be arriving very soon to relieve the night workers. It was time to go. The robbers zipped up their incredibly heavy canvas bags, wiped the sweat from their foreheads, and began making their way back up the stairs toward the lobby. But before they walked out the front doors and made their grand escape, the leader Samuel Nalo decided to do something so incredibly brazen, arrogant, and totally bizarre that the hostages would remember it vividly for the rest of their entire lives. Nalo told his men to wait by the door, and he turned around and walked all the way back down the corridor to the back office, where the 19 hotel employees were still sitting on the floor, securely handcuffed to the plumbing pipes. When the hostages heard the heavy footsteps approaching the room and saw Nalo step through the doorway, they all tensed up in absolute sheer terror. They squeezed their eyes shut, completely convinced that the robbers had finished their heist and were now coming back to tie up loose ends by executing all the witnesses. The room was dead silent, save for the terrified, ragged breathing of the employees. But Nalo did not raise his gun. Instead, he just looked around the room and smiled broadly. He reached his hand deep into his tailored tuxedo jacket pocket and pulled out a massive, thick stack of brand new, incredibly crisp $20 bills. He then slowly walked around the room, stepping very carefully over the legs of the bound hostages and he personally reached down and tucked a crisp $20 bill into the shirt pocket of every single terrified employee. As he handed out the cash, he politely thanked them for their complete cooperation, told them they had been absolutely wonderful hosts, and said the $20 was a small tip for their excellent service that evening. With the hostages sitting there, completely stunned and utterly confused by what was happening, Nalo simply turned around, walked out of the room, and rejoined his crew in the main lobby. The four men carried their massive heavy bags containing $27 million right out the front glass doors, stepped casually back into the back of the idling black Cadillac limousine. And as the driver stepped on the gas, they completely vanished into the early morning darkness of the Manhattan streets. About an hour later, the morning shift employees finally arrived at the Pierre Hotel. When they walked in, they found the lobby completely deserted, which was incredibly strange. As they started looking around, they eventually heard the muffled shouts for help coming from the back office. They rushed in, found the 19 night shift employees, handcuffed to the pipes, and immediately called the police. When the NYPD and the FBI arrived on the scene and descended into the vault, they were absolutely totally floored by the sheer scale of the robbery. It was a completely flawless heist. The robbers had left virtually no physical evidence, they had not harmed a single person, and they had seemingly just disappeared into thin air with a mountain of wealth. The police launched a massive nationwide manhunt, absolutely desperate to find the men in the tuxedos. But for years, the case went completely cold. It would actually take several years before Samuel Nalo and his crew were finally caught, and it was absolutely not because of some brilliant, masterful police detective work. The entire perfect crime completely unraveled because the robbers eventually started fighting over how to divide the massive pile of stolen loot. Greed got the better of them, they began arguing, and eventually members of the crew began violently betraying each other and secretly feeding information to the federal authorities in exchange for immunity. Samuel Nalo was eventually tracked down, arrested, and sent to a high-security federal prison, but his story did not end there. Many years later, in 1988, after he had been released and was back operating in the criminal underworld, Nalo was actually brutally assassinated by a rival criminal, ending his incredibly lucrative career with a bullet. But even after all the arrests, the extensive interrogations, and the massive federal investigations, more than half of the $27 million in priceless jewelry that was taken from the Pierre Hotel was never recovered. It essentially vanished off the face of the earth, and its exact location remains a complete mystery to this very day. The incredibly surreal image of a well-dressed criminal politely tucking crisp $20 bills into the pockets of unharmed, thoroughly confused hostages slowly fades away into a much more terrifying reality at 30,000 feet in the air, a place where a very different type of weapon is suddenly drawn, and absolute mercy simply does not exist. In the middle of October in 1970, a commercial passenger aircraft known as Aeroflot Flight 244 was sitting on the tarmac at a small airport in Batumi, a coastal city located in the Soviet Union, right along the edge of the Black Sea. It was a completely routine, incredibly short domestic flight that was scheduled to travel north to the city of Krasnodar. Because it was such a short trip, there were only 46 passengers on board, along with a very small flight crew. Among that crew was a 19-year-old flight attendant named Nadezhda Kurchenko. Nadezhda was incredibly well-liked by everyone she worked with. She was young, vibrant, and she had just recently gotten engaged to be married. She was actually using this job to save up money for her upcoming wedding, which was only a few months away. As the passengers began boarding the aircraft that morning, Nadezhda stood near the front of the cabin with a bright, welcoming smile, completely unaware that the people walking past her were about to turn this routine flight into an absolute bloodbath. Now, back in 1970, airport security in the Soviet Union was practically non-existent. There were no metal detectors, no X-ray machines for luggage, and no pat-downs. Passengers simply showed their tickets and walked right out onto the tarmac and up the stairs into the plane. Sitting in the very front row of the aircraft, right behind the cockpit door, was a 46-year-old man named Pranas Brzezinskis, and sitting directly next to him was his 15-year-old son, Algirdas. Pranas was a man who deeply hated the Soviet government. He had been planning for months to defect to the West, but he knew the Soviet government would never just allow him to pack up and leave the country. So he had brainwashed his teenage son into helping him execute a highly violent, completely desperate plan. The two of them were wearing large, heavy raincoats, and even though it had not been raining that hard outside, the coats were completely soaking wet. But the flight attendants did not think much of it. What they did not know was that underneath those wet coats, wrapped in plastic to keep them dry, Pranas and his son were concealing two fully loaded sawed-off shotguns, several handguns, and live fragmentation grenades. At exactly 12:30 in the afternoon, Aeroflot Flight 244 took off and began climbing over the dark waters of the Black Sea. The flight was incredibly smooth. About 10 minutes after takeoff, when the plane reached its cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign clicked off. Nadezhda, the 19-year-old flight attendant, stepped out of the small galley area and began walking down the aisle, carrying a silver tray filled with small glasses of mineral water for the passengers. As she approached the very front row, Pranas Brzezinska suddenly stood up from his seat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crumpled piece of paper which he aggressively shoved onto Nadezhda's tray. Nadezhda looked down at the paper, totally confused. The note was a printed message demanding that the flight crew immediately divert the aircraft and fly across the border to Turkey. It also stated that any resistance would be met with deadly force. Nadezhda looked up from the note and saw Pranas pulling the heavy, soaking wet raincoat away from his body. And as the coat fell away, he raised the massive sawed-off shotgun and pointed it directly at her chest. At the same time, his 15-year-old son, Algirdas, stood up completely, revealing his own hidden weapons. Any normal teenager or young adult in this situation would have been absolutely paralyzed by sheer terror. They would have simply done whatever the man with the gun said. But Nadezhda was incredibly brave. Instead of quietly stepping aside and allowing Pranas to enter the cockpit, she immediately dropped her tray of water glasses. The glasses shattered loudly all over the floor of the cabin. She then spun around, threw her entire body flat against the heavy wooden door of the cockpit to block it, and she screamed at the top of her lungs, shouting to the pilots and the passengers that these men were armed and they were trying to take over the plane. Pranas did not even hesitate. The very second she screamed, he stepped forward, raised the shotgun, and pulled the trigger at point-blank range. The deafening, booming sound of the shotgun blast echoed through the tiny enclosed cabin. Nadezhda was hit squarely in the chest, and she immediately collapsed to the floor, bleeding profusely. She died almost instantly, sacrificing her own life in an incredibly heroic attempt to warn the pilots. The passengers in the cabin began screaming in absolute horror, scrambling over their seats to get away from the front of the plane. But Pranas and his son ignored them. Pranas simply stepped right over the lifeless body of the young flight attendant, raised his leg, and kicked the cockpit door completely off its hinges. Inside the cockpit, the pilot, Captain Georgi Chakrakia, and his co-pilot had heard the scream and the massive gunshot. But before they could even react, the door burst open and Pranas stormed in completely unhinged and firing wildly. He unleashed a barrage of bullets into the tiny enclosed space of the cockpit. The co-pilot was struck immediately in the shoulder and slumped forward over his controls. Captain Chakrakia turned his head and was instantly shot in the spine, the bullet completely paralyzing him from the waist down. Another bullet tore through his arm. The entire cockpit was instantly transformed into a horrific, incredibly chaotic scene of absolute carnage. Dark, thick, red blood was pooling everywhere, dripping down the walls and flowing heavily over the electronic instrument panels. The smell of gun smoke and copper filled the air, and the plane began to pitch violently as the wounded pilots lost control of the yoke. Pranas stood right behind the bleeding, paralyzed captain, pressed the searing hot barrel of his gun directly against the back of the captain's head, and screamed at him to turn the plane around and head for the Turkish border, or else he would blow his brains out and crash the plane into the ocean himself. Captain Chakrakia was in agonizing, unimaginable pain, and he was losing an incredible amount of blood. He knew that if he passed out, everyone on board the aircraft was going to die. So, running entirely on adrenaline and pure willpower, the paralyzed captain managed to pull the yoke back, stabilize the wildly diving aircraft, and turn the nose of the plane toward the south. For the next incredibly tense, horrifying 30 minutes, the passengers sat in the back of the plane in total absolute silence. Algirdas, the 15-year-old son, stood in the aisle holding a live grenade, threatening to blow the entire plane out of the sky if anyone dared to move a single muscle. Meanwhile, up in the cockpit, the pilots were slowly bleeding to death as they navigated the plane across the international border and into Turkish airspace. Finally, through sheer unbelievable determination, the captain spotted the runway of an airport in Trabzon, Turkey. Despite having no feeling in his legs and limited use of his arms, he somehow managed to bring the massive, bullet-riddled commercial aircraft down for a hard but completely successful landing. The very second the wheels touched the tarmac, the engines were cut and the plane rolled to a stop. Within minutes, the Turkish military completely surrounded the aircraft. They had their rifles aimed at the windows, expecting a massive drawn-out hostage situation, but that is not what happened. Once the plane was safely on the ground in a non-Soviet country, Pranas and Algirdas simply opened the main cabin door, walked down the metal stairs, and very calmly surrendered their weapons to the Turkish soldiers. They did not resist, they did not make any demands. They just put their hands in the air and gave themselves up. They believed that because they were defecting from the Soviet Union, the West would view them as political heroes and grant them immediate asylum. When the news of this horrific hijacking reached Moscow, the Soviet government was absolutely furious. This was the very first successful commercial airline hijacking in the entire history of the Soviet Union. The Soviets immediately demanded that the Turkish government extradite Pranas and his son back to Moscow so they could be put up against a wall and executed by a firing squad for the brutal murder of Nadezhda Kurchenko. But Turkey, which was a member of NATO and heavily aligned with the United States during the Cold War, completely refused to hand them over. Instead, the Turkish courts put the father and son on trial locally. They argued that the hijacking was politically motivated rather than just a cold-blooded murder, and as a result, they handed down incredibly light sentences. Pranas was sentenced to just 8 years in prison, and his teenage son was given only 2 years. But it gets even crazier. A few years later, the Turkish government passed a general amnesty law, and the two hijackers were quietly released from prison long before their sentences were over. After being released, the father and son made their way to Venezuela, and then eventually they illegally crossed the border into the United States via Canada. They settled down in the city of Santa Monica, California, completely changing their names and attempting to start a brand new life. Pranas changed his name to Frank White, and Algirdas became Albert Victor White. For decades, they lived quietly in the United States, working as house painters. But the Soviet Union never forgot what they did, and they constantly pressured the US government to deport them. The US refused, and the two men managed to evade justice for the horrific murder of that 19-year-old flight attendant for over 30 years. But as it turns out, karma has a very dark, incredibly ironic way of balancing the scales. By the time the year 2002 rolled around, Pranas was an incredibly bitter, highly paranoid, angry old man in his late 70s. He was constantly fighting with his son Algirdas, who was now a middle-aged man in his late 40s. The two of them were living together in a small apartment in Santa Monica, and their relationship had completely deteriorated into toxic. Daily shouting matches. Pranas was highly controlling and deeply verbally abusive. One afternoon, during a particularly violent, explosive argument inside their apartment, the years of built-up rage and resentment finally boiled completely over. Algirdas, the very same boy who had helped his father commit a brutal murder on an airplane 32 years earlier, snapped. He picked up a heavy, solid iron gym dumbbell from the floor of the apartment, walked over to his 77-year-old father, and brutally beat him to death, completely caving in his skull. When the police arrived at the apartment, Algirdas did exactly what he had done in Turkey all those years ago. He did not run. He simply stood there, raised his hands, and calmly surrendered to the authorities. He was eventually tried for murder and sentenced to 16 years in a California state prison. And so the man who had initiated the very first incredibly bloody Soviet hijacking and who had managed to completely escape international justice for over 3 decades finally met his end at the hands of the very person he had dragged into his criminal life in the first place. The dark, thick red blood pooling over the electronic instruments of a hijacked aircraft is an absolutely terrifying sight, but it is nothing compared to the massive, suffocating wall of black smoke that was preparing to swallow the entire friend sky of South America's most bustling metropolis. On the morning of February 24th, 1972, the sprawling, incredibly dense city of São Paulo, Brazil, was absolutely buzzing with activity. Right in the heart of the downtown commercial district stood the Andraus Building. This was a massive, highly modern 32-story skyscraper that housed dozens of corporate offices for massive international companies. And on this particular Thursday, there were hundreds of businessmen, secretaries, and corporate executives inside, all just going about their normal daily routines. Down at the base of this massive concrete and tinted glass tower, occupying the first couple of floors, was a bustling, highly popular department store that was absolutely packed with daytime shoppers. The streets outside were gridlocked with cars and pedestrians, and it was shaping up to be just another totally normal, incredibly hot summer day in South America's largest and most chaotic metropolis. Right around noon, as people in the offices above were starting to pack up their desks, grab their coats, and head out for their lunch breaks, a massive, brightly lit neon advertising sign mounted on the exterior of the department store on the second floor began to silently malfunction. Deep inside the thick electrical casing of the sign, a single highly degraded wire suddenly short-circuited. A tiny, completely unnoticed electrical spark jumped from the exposed wire and immediately ignited some of the incredibly cheap, highly flammable building materials lining the outside of the store. At first, it was just a tiny, smoldering orange flame tucked away where nobody could see it. But because the interior of the building was heavily constructed using incredibly combustible acoustic ceiling tiles, thick synthetic carpets, and large amounts of exposed decorative wood paneling, that tiny spark rapidly exploded into a massive, roaring wall of fire. Within just a matter of minutes, the incredibly aggressive flames completely swallowed the entire department store on the lower levels and began rapidly shooting up the exterior of the 32-story skyscraper. Now, normally, a modern high-rise building of this size would have heavy, solid steel fire doors installed in the stairwells to completely seal off the floors and physically stop a fire from spreading upwards. But the Andraus Building did not have those doors installed, and there were virtually no external fire escapes. As a result, the central stairwells and the massive elevator shafts of the tower acted exactly like a giant vertical chimney. The intense, superheated air and thick, highly toxic black smoke were violently sucked up the shafts, feeding the fire massive amounts of oxygen and creating an unstoppable inferno. People working on the upper floors suddenly realized that their air conditioning units were pumping thick, choking gray smoke directly into their offices. When they ran out into the carpeted hallways and frantically pulled open the doors to the central stairwells to escape, they were immediately met with an impenetrable, boiling wall of pitch-black smoke and roaring orange flames. The heat was so intense, it physically pushed them back into the hallways. Going down the stairs was absolutely impossible. They were completely cut off from the ground, trapped hundreds of feet in the air inside a massive burning cage. Total, absolute panic immediately set in. The heat radiating from the lower floors was becoming so incredibly intense that the massive aluminum window frames holding the exterior glass in place actually began to melt and warp. As the metal twisted and buckled under the immense thermal stress, the giant panes of thick office window glass suddenly shattered. They exploded outward and rained down thousands of razor-sharp glass daggers onto the crowded city streets below, causing terrified pedestrians and early arriving first responders to run for their lives, covering their heads to avoid being sliced to ribbons. Down on the ground, the Sao Paulo Fire Department had arrived in massive numbers, completely surrounding the base of the tower with fire trucks. But they quickly realized they were completely helpless. Their absolute tallest ladders could only reach up to the lower floors of the building. And their heavy fire hoses did not have nearly enough water pressure to reach the raging inferno that was now completely engulfing the middle and upper sections of the 32-story skyscraper. The firefighters could only stand there and watch as the building burned uncontrollably. With absolutely no other options, and the flames aggressively chewing their way up through the ceilings right beneath their feet, hundreds of terrified office workers began scrambling upward. They broke through the heavy roof access doors and poured out onto the very top of the massive building. Over 300 people were now completely crammed onto the roof of the skyscraper. They were completely surrounded by a massive, towering column of thick black smoke that was shooting hundreds of meters up into the sky, completely blotting out the midday sun and casting an eerie dark shadow over the entire downtown district. The heat on the roof was absolutely agonizing. The intense thermal radiation from the fire burning just a few floors beneath them was causing the thick black tar on the roof to literally melt and bubble. And the soles of people's shoes were actually beginning to stick and melt onto the concrete. The air was so incredibly thick with toxic choking smoke that people were frantically ripping off their expensive dress shirts and blouses, soaking them with whatever leftover water or coffee they had, and wrapping them tightly around their faces, just to avoid suffocating to death. They were completely trapped on top of a giant burning Roman candle, and they knew it was only a matter of time before the flames breached the roof and burned them all alive. Down on the ground, the city's mayor and the local military commanders realized that a traditional ground rescue was completely impossible, and that if they did not do something completely radical immediately, over 300 people were going to die on that roof. So, an emergency broadcast went out across all radio frequencies, calling on every single available military police and private civilian helicopter pilot in the entire region to immediately converge on the Andraus Building. What happened next is widely considered to be one of the most incredible, highly dangerous, and completely unprecedented aviation rescues in world history. A massive, totally uncoordinated fleet of helicopters, ranging from large, heavy military transport choppers to tiny two-seater private civilian helicopters belonging to wealthy local businessmen, began swarming the skies above downtown Sao Paulo. But as the pilots approached the burning skyscraper, they realized that they could not even see the building. The smoke column rising from the Andraus Tower was so incredibly thick, black, and highly turbulent that flying into it was essentially a total suicide mission. One wrong move, a sudden gust of wind, or a slight miscalculation, and the helicopter blades would smash directly into the building's heavy radio antennas or the massive concrete elevator shafts protruding from the roof, sending the choppers plummeting 30 stories down to the street. But knowing that hundreds of innocent people were literally minutes away from dying in absolute agony, the pilots decided to risk their own lives and go in anyway. Because the pilots were flying completely blind into the black smoke, the desperate, severely exhausted office workers trapped on the roof had to physically guide them in. Brave individuals stood dangerously close to the sheer unguarded drop-off of the 32-story roof, completely exposing themselves to the smoke and the blistering heat. They frantically waved their brightly colored shirts and shouted at the top of their lungs to give the incoming pilots a visual and auditory reference point. The helicopter pilots slowly, agonizingly hovered down through the blinding black smoke, relying entirely on the shadowy, barely visible figures of the people waving their shirts. The aviation conditions were an absolute nightmare. The intense heat rising from the building was causing massive, violent thermal updrafts, throwing the helicopters around like cheap plastic toys and threatening to completely flip them upside down. Furthermore, the superheated air was incredibly thin, which meant the helicopter rotors had to spin much faster just to generate enough lift to stay airborne. But one by one, through sheer unbelievable skill and absolute nerves of steel, the pilots managed to touch their skids down onto the tiny, heavily congested concrete helipad located right in the center of the roof. The very second a helicopter touched down, dozens of terrified, severely burned, and completely exhausted office workers would rush forward. They piled into the small cabins, completely ignoring maximum weight capacities, and some people even clung desperately to the outside landing skids, dangling hundreds of feet in the air. The helicopters would immediately lift off, completely overloaded their engines, screaming as they fought for altitude. They would dive back out of the thick smoke fly a short distance to drop the completely traumatized survivors off in a nearby open city square, and then immediately turn around and fly right back into the deadly inferno to get more people. For over 3 straight hours, this massive, highly dangerous, and completely improvised aerial ballet continued without a single break. The pilots flew through the blistering heat and toxic smoke again and again, risking a catastrophic mid-air collision or an engine failure with every single approach. By the time the massive fire was finally brought under control by the ground crews much later that evening, the beautiful, highly modern Andraus Building was completely gutted, reduced to nothing more than a towering blackened concrete skeleton. Tragically, 16 people had lost their lives in the inferno, mostly those who were hopelessly trapped on the lower floors and could not make their way to the roof in time. But, incredibly, against all logical odds, thanks to the sheer bravery and absolute unmatched skill of those helicopter pilots, over 330 people were successfully airlifted off the burning roof and completely saved from certain death. But here is the most chilling, unbelievable detail of this entire horrifying story. When investigators eventually looked into the building's construction and architectural records after the fire, they discovered a completely mind-blowing fact. The small concrete helipad located on the roof of the Andraus Building, the exact spot where all 330 survivors had clustered, and literally the only possible flat, reinforced surface where those helicopters could have landed, had just been completely constructed and officially finished a very short time before the fire broke out. If that electrical short had happened just a few months earlier, there would have been absolutely nowhere for those rescue choppers to land, and every single person who ran up to that roof would have perished. The deafening mechanical roar of the helicopter blades violently tearing through the black smoke and the agonizing screams of the trapped survivors slowly give way to the steady, quiet hum of a commercial jet cruising peacefully high above. The clouds. A totally serene environment that is about to be violently ripped apart when a small device hidden deep in the cargo bay begins its deadly countdown. On the afternoon of February 21st, 1970, Swissair Flight 330, a massive, highly advanced Convair CV-990 jetliner, was sitting on the tarmac at the bustling Kloten Airport in Zurich, Switzerland. The flight was scheduled to make a totally routine, multi-hour trip across Europe to Tel Aviv, Israel, and the weather that day was absolutely perfect for flying. Inside the brightly lit cabin, 47 people were comfortably settling into their seats. The passengers included a diverse mix of excited tourists, wealthy businessmen, and local residents who were just looking forward to reaching their destination. The flight crew, led by Captain Karl Berlinger, an incredibly experienced and highly respected pilot, was running through their extensive pre-flight safety checks up in the cockpit. Everything was totally normal. The massive jet engines spooled up with a deafening roar. The plane slowly taxied to the main runway, and it took off effortlessly into the incredibly clear, freezing winter sky without a single mechanical issue. As the plane leveled out, the passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, the flight attendants began preparing the beverage carts in the galleys, and the entire cabin was filled with the quiet, peaceful hum of the jet engines as they climbed high over the beautiful snow-covered peaks of the Swiss Alps. But just 9 short minutes after takeoff, as the plane reached an altitude of roughly 14,000 feet, which is about 4,300 meters, the peaceful, relaxed atmosphere inside the cabin was violently shattered. Deep inside, the pitch-black, unpressurized rear cargo hold of the aircraft tucked away inside a completely ordinary-looking mailed package. A highly sophisticated barometric pressure switch suddenly clicked into place. As the plane had climbed higher into the sky and the atmospheric air pressure inside the cargo bay had naturally dropped, that tiny mechanical shift triggered a massive hidden explosive device. A sudden, incredibly deep, muffled explosion completely rocked the aircraft. The blast did not immediately tear the plane into pieces, but it violently blew out a large section of the cargo hold floor and instantly ignited a massive, raging chemical fire completely out of sight from the terrified passengers and crew. Up in the cockpit, Captain Berlinger and his co-pilot immediately heard the dull, heavy thud of the explosion and felt the massive aircraft violently shudder beneath their feet. Red warning lights and loud alarms instantly began blaring across the electronic instrument panels. Captain Berlinger immediately grabbed his radio and contacted the control tower in Zurich, calmly and professionally reporting that they had experienced a sudden, massive depressurization and a suspected fire on board, and they needed immediate priority clearance to turn the massive jet around and make an emergency landing. The control tower instantly cleared all surrounding airspace and gave them a direct vector back to the airport. But as the pilots banked the plane to turn around, an incredibly thick, highly toxic pitch-black smoke began pouring out of the air vents directly into the small enclosed cockpit. This smoke was not just normal fire smoke. It was thick, oily, and completely impenetrable. Within seconds, the pilots were completely blinded. They could not see out the reinforced glass windows, and infinitely worse, they could not even read their own brightly lit instrument panels right in front of their faces. They were flying a massive commercial airliner completely blind. All of their critical electrical systems, including their primary navigation and mechanical flight controls, began rapidly short-circuiting and completely failing as the superheated fire melted right through the thick bundles of wiring beneath the floorboards. Inside the main passenger cabin, the situation was an absolute unimaginable nightmare. The exact same toxic black smoke was violently flooding the aisles, rapidly sucking all the breathable oxygen right out of the air. The terrified passengers were trapped in their seats, coughing violently, completely unable to see anything around them, and slowly, agonizingly asphyxiating in the dark. The pilots, who were practically choking to death themselves and completely flying blind, desperately tried to muscle the heavy aircraft back towards Zurich using only their manual, unassisted backup controls. But the intense fire had caused catastrophic structural damage to the plane's tail section, and they were rapidly losing complete control of the aircraft's pitch and elevation. The plane began a steep, terrifying, completely uncontrollable dive toward the Earth. Realizing that the electrical systems were completely dead, the flight controls were entirely unresponsive, and they were plummeting rapidly toward the ground at hundreds of miles per hour, the co-pilot picked up the radio microphone for one final, absolutely chilling transmission. Through the heavy radio static and the roaring sound of the failing engines, the air traffic controllers down in Zurich listened in total helpless silence as the co-pilot's voice cracked over the radio. His final haunting words were, "We are crashing. Goodbye, everybody." Moments later, the massive jetliner, traveling at an incredibly high rate of speed, slammed nose first into a dense snow-covered pine forest near the small Swiss town of Wöhrenlingen. The sheer force of the impact was absolutely cataclysmic. The aircraft instantly exploded into a massive, towering fireball that instantly melted the snow and incinerated everything in its immediate path. The impact completely pulverized the plane, sending heavy, jagged metal fragments flying for kilometers in every direction. When the massive cloud of smoke and steam finally began to clear, the scene was absolutely horrifying. Pieces of the destroyed fuselage, charred luggage, and twisted passenger seats were left hanging morbidly from the high branches of the surrounding pine trees, contrasting starkly with the pristine white snow. Emergency rescue crews immediately rushed to the crash site, desperately hoping to find anyone who had somehow survived the impact. But as they combed through the massive smoking crater in the middle of the freezing forest, they quickly realized it was completely hopeless. Not a single person survived. All 47 passengers and crew members were instantly killed. When forensic investigators from the Swiss government began painstakingly combing through the scattered wreckage, they quickly found the undeniable chemical signatures of high explosives. This was not a mechanical failure or a pilot error, it was a deliberate, highly calculated act of terrorism. They quickly traced the remnants of the bomb to a mail parcel that had been loaded onto the plane at the very last minute. The militant group, known as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP, had constructed a highly sophisticated, altitude-triggered bomb. But here is the absolute most chilling, sickening twist to this entire tragedy. The bomb was never actually intended for Swissair Flight 330. The terrorists had explicitly intended to blow up an entirely different flight belonging to the Israeli airline El Al, which was scheduled to fly the exact same route to Tel Aviv that very same afternoon. They had mailed the explosive package through the local postal service, perfectly timing it so it would be loaded directly into the cargo bay of the El Al plane. But on that specific day, the El Al flight experienced a minor routine delay. The automated postal routing system at the airport, which simply processed and forwarded mail based on destinations and departure times, automatically took the delayed package and unknowingly shoved it into the cargo hold of the very next available flight heading to Tel Aviv, which just happened to be Swissair Flight 330. 47 completely innocent people were blown out of the sky and violently killed simply because of a random automated mail sorting error. The Swiss government quickly identified the Jordanian suspects responsible for mailing the bomb, and the Swiss public demanded swift, absolute justice for the deadliest aviation disaster in their country's entire history. But then, something incredibly strange, highly secretive, and deeply frustrating happened. The massive international investigation suddenly ground to a complete halt, citing a lack of extradition treaties and immense, highly complicated international political pressure. The Swiss authorities quietly backed away from the case. The suspects were never arrested, they were never put on trial, and the police files were essentially sealed away in a vault For decades, highly credible rumors circulated that the Swiss government, absolutely terrified of facing more bombings on their own soil, had engaged in top-secret backroom negotiations with the Palestine Liberation Organization. It was widely believed that Switzerland essentially agreed to completely drop the investigation and let the killers walk free in exchange for a secret ironclad guarantee that Swiss targets would never be attacked by the group again. The victims' devastated families fought tirelessly for decades to get the case reopened and force the government to act. But in the year 2000, the Swiss authorities officially closed the books on the investigation forever, ensuring that the people who brought down Flight 330 would never see the inside of a courtroom. While a bomb stealthily brought down an aircraft from the inside high above the snow-covered Alps down on the busy streets of South America, a brutal, highly orchestrated ambush was carried out in broad daylight to eliminate a political pawn from the outside. In the crisp early morning hours of October 22, 1970, the sprawling capital city of Santiago, Chile, was waking up to a day of immense, incredibly heavy political tension. The entire country was essentially sitting on a massive powder keg. Just a few weeks earlier, a highly controversial, heavily contested presidential election had taken place, and a man named Salvador Allende was preparing to officially take office. But behind closed doors in the dark, shadowy corners of the political underworld, there were extremely powerful, incredibly dangerous factions that were absolutely determined to make sure Allende never actually made it to the presidential palace. However, these right-wing extremist groups, who were actually receiving massive amounts of secret, highly classified financial backing from the United States Central Intelligence Agency, had one massive, immovable obstacle standing completely in their way. And that obstacle was a 56-year-old man named General René Schneider. General Schneider was the commander-in-chief of the entire Chilean army. He was a highly decorated, incredibly respected career military officer who possessed an absolute unbreakable moral compass. He was the author of what became widely known as the Schneider Doctrine, which was a strict, non-negotiable military policy stating that the armed forces must remain completely neutral and absolutely never interfere in the democratic political process of the country. To the extremist groups and the foreign intelligence operatives who were desperately trying to orchestrate a massive military coup to overthrow the newly elected government, General Schneider was a total nightmare. Because the military deeply loved and respected him, the soldiers would never rise up and overthrow the government as long as he was in command. The conspirators quickly realized that they could not bribe him, they could not intimidate him, and they could not politically maneuver around him. So they decided that General Schneider simply had to be completely removed from the board. The plot they completely masterminded was incredibly brazen. A rogue, highly militant faction led by a disgraced former military officer named Roberto Vio decided that they were going to ambush General Schneider right in the middle of the city during his morning commute, violently drag him out of his vehicle and kidnap him. The ultimate goal was not necessarily to murder him right there on the street, but rather to abduct him, hide him away in a secret location, and then blame the entire kidnapping on radical left-wing groups. They fully believed that if they framed the leftists for kidnapping the beloved commander-in-chief, the military would become absolutely enraged, completely abandon the Schneider Doctrine, and immediately launch a violent nationwide coup to take over the country. On the morning of October 22nd, General Schneider stepped out of his beautiful, quiet home in the affluent suburbs of Santiago. He was dressed impeccably in his crisp, heavily decorated military uniform, carrying his briefcase and preparing for just another normal day at the military headquarters. He walked down the steps and climbed into the back seat of his official state vehicle, which was a massive, completely unarmored Mercedes-Benz. Sitting in the driver's seat was his young, highly loyal military chauffeur, Corporal Leopoldo Moreira. The general settled into the plush leather back seat, opened his morning newspaper, and told the corporal to head into the city. As the large, sleek Mercedes-Benz cruised down the quiet, tree-lined avenue of Martín de Zamora, everything seemed completely routine. The morning sun was just starting to burn off the early fog, and normal citizens were out walking their dogs and heading to work. But what General Schneider and his driver completely failed to realize was that they were driving directly into a highly coordinated, incredibly dangerous trap, waiting just a few blocks ahead. Idling quietly on various side streets and alleyways were four completely unmarked civilian vehicles filled with over a dozen heavily armed, highly agitated young men belonging to the extremist faction. They had been secretly stalking the general's daily movements for weeks, entirely memorizing his exact route and timing. As the Mercedes approached a major intersection, Corporal Moreira gently pressed the brake pedal to slow down for the traffic ahead. The very second the Mercedes came to a rolling stop, the trap was violently sprung. Suddenly, a civilian car shot out from a side street and aggressively slammed its brakes directly in front of the general's vehicle, completely cutting off any forward route of escape. Before the corporal could even react or throw the car into reverse, a second vehicle screeched up right behind their rear bumper, boxing them in from the back. Immediately, two more cars swerved aggressively into the opposing lanes, pinning the Mercedes from both the left and the right sides. In a matter of 2 seconds, the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army was completely trapped inside an inescapable cage of solid metal right in the middle of a bustling city street. General Schneider dropped his newspaper and looked out the window in absolute shock. The doors of the four surrounding vehicles instantly flew open, and roughly 10 young men piled out onto the pavement. But these men did not immediately draw firearms. Because they wanted to kidnap the general alive and drag him into one of their vehicles, they had come equipped with something much more visceral and terrifying. They were holding massive, heavy iron sledgehammers. The young men charged the trapped Mercedes-Benz from every single angle. They raised the heavy sledgehammers high above their heads and began violently, relentlessly smashing them into the windows of the car. The deafening, explosive sound of heavy iron completely shattering the thick safety glass echoed down the quiet street. The windows did not just break, they completely exploded inward. Thousands of razor-sharp, jagged shards of glass rained down inside the cabin like a massive fragmentation grenade. The terrifying shower of broken glass hit General Schneider directly in the face, completely shredding the skin on his cheeks, his forehead, and his neck. Blood immediately began pouring down the general's face, soaking into the pristine collar of his military uniform. The attackers reached their hands blindly through the shattered, jagged window frames, trying to violently unlock the doors and drag the bleeding general out into the street. But despite being completely ambushed, severely cut, and heavily bleeding, General Schneider was an incredibly hardened, highly experienced military veteran, and he absolutely refused to be taken as a hostage. Ignoring the blinding pain and the chaos erupting all around him, the general reached his hand inside his uniform jacket and unholstered his official military sidearm, a heavy Colt .38 caliber revolver. But as the general raised the heavy revolver to defend himself and his terrified driver, the young men wielding the sledgehammers saw the glint of the gun barrel through the shattered windows. They completely panicked. The meticulous, highly planned kidnapping operation instantly, completely unraveled into a chaotic, blind bloodbath. The attackers immediately dropped their sledgehammers, reached into their jackets, and pulled out their own semi-automatic pistols. Without any hesitation, they pointed their weapons directly through the broken windows of the Mercedes and opened fire at point-blank range. The deafening, rapid-fire cracks of the handguns completely drowned out the sounds of the screaming bystanders on the street. General Schneider never even got the chance to pull the trigger of his revolver. He was violently struck multiple times in the chest, the shoulder, and the abdomen. The heavy bullets tore completely through his internal organs, and the massive impact threw him violently backward into the plush leather seats. His revolver slipped from his bloody hand and fell to the floorboards. The attackers, completely terrified by what they had just done, and realizing that they had just brutally shot the most powerful military figure in the entire country in broad daylight, immediately turned and sprinted back to their vehicles. They jumped in, slammed on the gas, and sped away in multiple directions, tires squealing against the pavement, completely abandoning the scene and leaving the general to die in the back of his completely destroyed car. Inside the Mercedes, Corporal Moreira was completely covered in broken glass, trembling in absolute horror. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw his commander-in-chief slumped over in the back seat, completely covered in blood and gasping heavily for air. Running on pure, unadulterated adrenaline, the young corporal threw the heavy Mercedes into gear, aggressively slammed the accelerator to the floor, and violently rammed his way past one of the abandoned blockade vehicles. He drove like an absolute madman through the crowded streets of Santiago, blasting the horn and running through red lights, desperately making a straight line for the nearest military hospital. When they finally skidded to a halt outside the emergency room doors, a swarm of military medics rushed out, pulled the critically wounded general from the blood-soaked back seat, and immediately rushed him into emergency surgery. For 3 incredibly long, agonizing days, General René Schneider fought desperately for his life in the intensive care unit. The entire nation of Chile came to a complete, absolute standstill. The news of the horrific daylight ambush sent massive shockwaves through the government and the military. The newly elected president, Salvador Allende, actually rushed directly to the military hospital and sat vigil waiting completely anxiously in the hallways while the surgeons desperately tried to repair the massive internal damage caused by the point-blank gunfire. But despite the absolute best efforts of the medical staff, the damage was simply too severe. On October 25th, 1970, General René Schneider officially succumbed to his massive injuries and passed away. But here is the incredibly ironic, completely spectacular twist to this incredibly dark story. The rogue faction and the foreign intelligence operatives who had entirely orchestrated this massive bloody ambush had assumed that kidnapping or harming the general would cause the military to instantly snap blame the leftists and violently overthrow the government. But the exact opposite happened. The horrific, cowardly murder of their beloved commander-in-chief did not fracture the military. It completely, absolutely united them. The military investigators quickly uncovered the truth, realizing that it was actually right-wing extremists who had murdered their boss. Filled with absolute rage and a deep, unyielding desire to honor General Schneider's legacy and his strict doctrine of non-interference, the Chilean military doubled down on their commitment to the Constitution. They stood in absolute solidarity with the democratic process, ensuring that the presidential transition went completely flawlessly. The massive, highly funded conspiracy to trigger a coup had completely and utterly blown up in their faces, achieving the exact opposite of what they had so violently tried to accomplish. The mastermind, Roberto Vio, was eventually tracked down, arrested by military police, and sentenced to decades in a dark prison cell. A targeted political assassination at a bustling city intersection is a deeply calculated, incredibly precise act of violence. But what happens when violence is no longer a targeted bullet meant for a single man, but rather a blind, mechanical storm of death raining down indiscriminately on tens of thousands of completely innocent people? On the brisk, freezing afternoon of February 21st, 1970, the Kloten Airport in Zurich, Switzerland, was absolutely bustling with its usual weekend crowds. Families were saying their tearful goodbyes at the departure gates, businessmen in heavy woolen suits were rushing to Cat Nor connections, and the massive observation decks were lined with aviation enthusiasts watching the planes take off against the backdrop of the stunning snow-capped Swiss Alps. Sitting patiently on the icy tarmac, preparing for its scheduled departure to Tel Aviv, Israel, was Swissair Flight 330. The aircraft was a Convair CV-990 Coronado, which at the time was widely considered to be one of the absolute fastest, most highly advanced commercial jetliners in the entire world. It was a beautiful, sleek machine, and on this particular day, it was carrying 38 passengers and a highly experienced crew of 9. The man sitting in the left seat of the cockpit was Captain Karl Berlinger. He was an absolute legend within the Swiss aviation community. Before flying commercial airliners, Berlinger had spent years as a top-tier military pilot and an elite flight instructor. He was the kind of captain who knew every single inch of the aircraft, every switch, every dial, and every possible emergency procedure by pure muscle memory. Sitting next to him was his first officer, Armand Etienne, who was equally skilled and highly respected. Down in the passenger cabin, the atmosphere was incredibly relaxed and completely routine. The flight attendants were walking up and down the aisles, helping people stow their heavy winter coats in the overhead bins and handing out small candies before takeoff. Among the passengers were several Israeli citizens heading home, a handful of prominent journalists, and various tourists looking forward to the warmer climate of the Mediterranean. Absolutely nobody on board had any reason to suspect that they were buckling themselves into what was about to become a completely inescapable death trap. At precisely 1:14 p.m., Captain Berlinger pushed the heavy throttles forward and the massive Coronado jet roared down the runway. It lifted effortlessly into the freezing winter sky, completely cutting through the low-hanging clouds as it began its steep ascent. Inside the cabin, the seatbelt sign chimed and clicked off. Passengers immediately began to relax, reclining their seats and opening their newspapers. The flight attendants stepped into the galleys and began brewing fresh pots of coffee, the pleasant, rich aroma filling the aircraft. The flight was completely smooth, without even a hint of turbulence, and the incredibly scenic view of the Swiss Alps rolling out beneath them was absolutely breathtaking. But exactly 9 minutes after takeoff, as the massive aircraft crossed an altitude of roughly 14,000 feet, which is about 4,300 meters, the quiet, peaceful hum of the passenger cabin was violently interrupted. Deep down, below the passenger floorboards, completely out of sight, in the pitch-black, unpressurized rear cargo hold of the aircraft, was a heavily wrapped parcel that had been processed through the airport's automated postal system just hours earlier. Hidden inside that very ordinary-looking package was a highly sophisticated, incredibly deadly explosive device that had been meticulously wired to an altimeter. The bomb maker had specifically designed the device so that when the airplane reached a certain altitude and the atmospheric air pressure dropped, a tiny barometric switch would automatically close the electrical circuit. And at 14,000 feet, that is exactly what happened. A sudden, incredibly deep, muffled explosion completely rocked the aircraft. The blast was not powerful enough to instantly tear the massive plane into pieces, but it violently blew out a large section of the cargo hold floor and instantly ignited a massive roaring chemical fire. Because the explosion occurred in the unpressurized rear section of the plane, the incredibly aggressive fire immediately began burning through the aircraft's critical infrastructure. Up in the cockpit, Captain Berlinger and First Officer Etienne felt the massive jet violently shudder beneath their feet. A loud, heavy thud echoed through the airframe, followed immediately by a terrifying cascade of blaring red warning lights across their electronic instrument panels. The system was frantically alerting them that they had suffered a sudden massive depressurization and that a severe fire had broken out in the rear cargo bay. Captain Berlinger did not panic. He immediately grabbed his radio microphone and contacted the control tower back in Zurich. In a highly professional, incredibly calm voice, he reported that Swissair Flight 330 had experienced an onboard explosion and a rapidly spreading fire. He officially declared an emergency and requested priority clearance to turn the massive jet around and make an immediate emergency landing back at Cloton Airport. The air traffic controllers instantly cleared all surrounding airspace, ordered all other aircraft to hold their positions, and gave Flight 330 a direct straight-in vector back to the runway. But as Captain Berlinger grabbed the heavy yoke and banked the plane to begin the wide turn back towards Zurich, the situation on board catastrophically escalated. The chemical fire raging in the cargo hold was burning incredibly hot, and it was feeding on the highly flammable luggage and the aircraft's own hydraulic fluids. The intense heat quickly burned entirely through the floorboards, and an incredibly thick, highly toxic, pitch-black smoke began pouring directly into the main passenger cabin and the cockpit through the air conditioning vents. This was not just regular smoke from a wood fire. It was a heavy, oily, completely impenetrable cloud of toxic fumes generated by melting plastic and burning aviation fuel. Within a matter of seconds, the cockpit was completely flooded. The black smoke was so incredibly dense that the pilots were instantly totally blinded. They could not see out the reinforced glass windows to visually navigate the mountains. And infinitely worse, they could not even read their own brightly lit instrument panels located mere inches from their faces. They were flying a massive commercial airliner completely blind at hundreds of miles per hour over some of the most treacherous mountainous terrain in all of Europe. But the smoke was not just blinding them, it was actively suffocating them. The toxic fumes were rapidly sucking all of the breathable oxygen right out of the enclosed space, causing the pilots to violently cough and gasp for air as their lungs burned in absolute agony. Down in the main passenger cabin, the scene was an absolute unimaginable nightmare. The exact same toxic black smoke had violently flooded the aisles, completely plunging the cabin into total darkness. The terrified passengers were trapped in their seats, screaming in absolute horror, but their screams were quickly silenced as the toxic gas completely overwhelmed them. The smoke was so incredibly thick that they could not see the person sitting right next to them. Because the explosive blast had severed the electrical lines, the emergency oxygen masks did not properly deploy, leaving the passengers completely defenseless. They were slowly, agonizingly asphyxiating in the dark, trapped inside a flying metal tube that was rapidly filling with deadly poison. Back in the cockpit, Captain Berlinger and First Officer Etienne were desperately fighting to save the aircraft. Because they could not see their instruments, they were relying entirely on the physical feel of the yoke and the sounds of the engines. But the intense, superheated fire had now melted right through the thick bundles of electrical wiring and the critical hydraulic lines that ran along the belly of the plane. All of their primary navigation systems, their radios, and their mechanical flight controls began rapidly short-circuiting and completely failing. The massive aircraft started to heavily list to one side, completely ignoring the pilot's frantic, desperate inputs on the controls. The tail section of the plane, which had sustained massive structural damage from the blast and the subsequent fire, began to literally melt and warp under the extreme thermal stress. Realizing that they had completely lost all control of the aircraft, that the electrical systems were entirely dead, and that they were plummeting rapidly toward the ground in a terrifying, uncontrollable dive, First Officer Etienne reached out blindly in the thick, choking smoke and grabbed the radio microphone for one final, absolutely chilling transmission. Down in the control tower in Zurich, the air traffic controllers stood in total, helpless silence, staring at their radar screens as the blip representing Flight 330 began rapidly losing altitude. Through the heavy radio static and the roaring, deafening sound of the failing jet engines, the controllers listened in sheer horror as the first officer's voice cracked over the frequency. His final haunting words were spoken in German, and they translated to, "We are crashing, goodbye, everybody." Moments later, the massive Convair jetliner, traveling at an incredibly high rate of speed and trailing a massive plume of thick black smoke, slammed nose first into a dense, snow-covered pine forest near the small Swiss municipality of Würenlingen. The sheer force of the impact was absolutely cataclysmic. The aircraft instantly exploded into a massive, towering fireball that instantly vaporized the snow and completely incinerated the ancient pine trees in its immediate path. The violent impact completely pulverized the massive airplane, sending heavy, jagged metal fragments and burning debris flying for kilometers in every direction. The explosion was so incredibly powerful that it actually registered on local seismographs as a minor earthquake, and the shockwave shattered windows in nearby farmhouses. When the massive cloud of smoke, steam, and flying dirt finally began to clear, the scene left behind in the freezing forest was absolutely horrifying. A massive smoking crater had been violently gouged into the earth. Pieces of the destroyed fuselage, charred luggage, and twisted metal passenger seats were left hanging morbidly from the high branches of the surrounding pine trees, contrasting starkly with the pristine white snow. Emergency rescue crews. Local police officers and hundreds of civilian volunteers immediately rushed to the crash site, desperately hoping to find someone, anyone, who had somehow miraculously survived the impact. But as they combed through the massive smoking crater and the burning debris field in the middle of the freezing forest, they quickly realized it was completely hopeless. The devastation was absolute. Not a single person survived. All 47 passengers and crew members were instantly killed in the crash, although forensic examiners would later determine that many of the passengers had likely already succumbed to the toxic smoke inhalation before the plane even hit the ground. The entire nation of Switzerland was plunged into a state of deep, profound mourning. This was the absolute deadliest aviation disaster in the country's entire history, and the public demanded answers. When forensic investigators from the Swiss government began painstakingly combing through the scattered wreckage in the forest, they quickly found the undeniable chemical signatures of high explosives. This was not a tragic mechanical failure or a catastrophic pilot error. It was a deliberate, highly calculated, and incredibly cowardly act of terrorism. They quickly traced the remnants of the bomb to a mail parcel that had been loaded onto the plane at the very last minute in Zurich. It was soon discovered that a militant extremist group known as the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP, had constructed the highly sophisticated altitude-triggered bomb and mailed it to an address in Israel. But here is the absolute most chilling, sickening, and incredibly frustrating twist to this entire horrifying tragedy. The bomb was never actually intended for Swissair Flight 330. The terrorists had explicitly intended to blow up an entirely different flight belonging to the Israeli airline El Al, which was scheduled to fly the exact same route from Zurich to Tel Aviv that very same afternoon. They had mailed the explosive package through the local postal service, perfectly timing it so it would be loaded directly into the cargo bay of the El Al plane. But on that specific day, the El Al flight experienced a minor, totally routine delay. The automated postal routing system at the Zurich airport, which simply processed and forwarded massive bags of mail based on destinations and departure times, automatically took the delayed package and unknowingly shoved it into the cargo hold of the very next available flight heading to Tel Aviv, which just happened to be Swissair Flight 330. 47 completely innocent people, who had absolutely nothing to do with the political conflict, were blown out of the sky and violently killed simply because of a random automated mail sorting error. The Swiss government and international intelligence agencies quickly identified the specific Jordanian suspects responsible for building and mailing the bomb. The Swiss public demanded swift, absolute justice, expecting the government to hunt these men down and hold them accountable for the mass murder of their citizens. But then something incredibly strange, highly secretive, and deeply controversial happened. The massive international investigation suddenly ground to a complete, inexplicable halt. Citing a lack of formal extradition treaties and immense, highly complicated international political pressure, the Swiss authorities quietly backed away from the case. The suspects were never arrested, they were never put on trial, and the police files were essentially sealed away in a government vault. For decades, highly credible rumors circulated within the intelligence community that the Swiss government, absolutely terrified of facing more bombings on their own soil or having their own infrastructure targeted by the militant group, had engaged in top-secret backroom negotiations with the Palestine Liberation Organization. It was widely believed that Switzerland essentially agreed to completely drop the criminal investigation and let the killers walk free, in exchange for a secret, ironclad guarantee that Swiss targets would never be attacked by the group again. The victims' devastated families fought tirelessly for decades, hiring lawyers and petitioning the government to get the case reopened and force the authorities to act. But despite their relentless efforts in the year 2000, the Swiss authorities officially closed the books on the investigation forever, ensuring that the people who brought down Swissair Flight 330 would never see the inside of a courtroom and would never answer for their crimes. While a bomb stealthily brought down an aircraft from the inside, high above the snow-covered Alps down on the busy streets of South America, a brutal, highly orchestrated ambush was carried out in broad daylight to eliminate a political pawn from the outside. In the crisp early morning hours of October 22nd, 1970, the sprawling, incredibly dense capital city of Santiago, Chile, was waking up to a day of immense, almost suffocating political tension. The entire country was essentially sitting on top of a massive, incredibly volatile powder keg, and everyone could feel it in the air. Just a few weeks earlier, a highly controversial, heavily contested presidential election had taken place, and a man named Salvador Allende, who was a prominent left-wing candidate, was preparing to officially take office. But behind closed doors, completely hidden away in the dark, shadowy corners of the political underworld, there were extremely powerful, incredibly dangerous factions that were absolutely determined to make sure Allende never actually made it to the presidential palace. However, these right-wing extremist groups, who were actually receiving massive amounts of secret, highly classified financial backing and logistical support from the United States Central Intelligence Agency, had one massive, completely immovable obstacle standing directly in their way. And that obstacle was a 56-year-old man named General René Schneider. General Schneider was not just some low-level government official. He was the commander-in-chief of the entire Chilean army. He was a highly decorated, incredibly respected, and deeply beloved career military officer who possessed an absolute, unbreakable moral compass. He was the author of what became widely known throughout the country as the Schneider Doctrine. This doctrine was a strict, non-negotiable military policy, stating that the armed forces must remain completely neutral and absolutely never, under any circumstances, interfere in the democratic political process of the country. To the extremist groups and the foreign intelligence operatives who were desperately trying to orchestrate a massive military coup to violently overthrow the newly elected government, General Schneider was an absolute nightmare. Because the military deeply loved and respected him, the soldiers would never rise up and overthrow the government as long as he was in command. The conspirators quickly realized that they could not bribe him with money, they could not intimidate him with threats, and they could not politically maneuver around him. He was a stone wall. So they decided that General Schneider simply had to be completely removed from the board. The plot they eventually completely masterminded was incredibly brazen and highly complex. A rogue, highly militant faction led by a disgraced former military officer named Roberto Vio decided that they were going to ambush General Schneider right in the middle of the bustling city during his morning commute, violently drag him out of his vehicle, and kidnap him. The ultimate goal was not necessarily to murder him right there on the street in broad daylight, but rather to abduct him, hide him away in a secret, heavily guarded location, and then blame the entire kidnapping on radical left-wing groups. They fully believed that if they successfully framed the leftists for violently kidnapping the beloved commander-in-chief, the military would become absolutely enraged, completely abandon the peaceful Schneider doctrine, and immediately launch a violent nationwide coup to take over the country. It was an incredibly dark, highly calculated false flag operation designed to plunge the entire nation into absolute chaos. On the morning of October 22nd, General Schneider stepped out of the front door of his beautiful, quiet home in one of the highly affluent, tree-lined suburbs of Santiago. He was dressed impeccably in his crisp, heavily decorated military uniform, carrying his briefcase and mentally preparing for just another normal, busy day at the military headquarters. He walked down the front steps and climbed into the back seat of his official state vehicle, which was a massive, incredibly heavy, completely unarmored Mercedes-Benz. Sitting in the driver's seat was his young, highly loyal military chauffeur, Corporal Leopoldo Moreira. The general settled into the plush leather back seat, opened his morning newspaper, and calmly told the corporal to head into the city. As the large, sleek Mercedes-Benz cruised down the quiet, picturesque avenue of Martin de Zamora, everything seemed completely routine. The morning sun was just starting to burn off the early fog, and normal citizens were out walking their dogs, reading the paper, and heading to work. But what General Schneider and his driver completely failed to realize was that they were driving directly into a highly coordinated, incredibly dangerous trap. Waiting just a few blocks ahead, idling quietly on various side streets and narrow alleyways, were four completely unmarked civilian vehicles filled with over a dozen heavily armed, highly agitated young men belonging to the extremist faction. These men had been secretly stalking the general's daily movements for weeks, entirely memorizing his exact route, his timing, and the specific intersections where his car was forced to slow down. As the Mercedes approached a major highly trafficked intersection, Corporal Moreira gently pressed the brake pedal to slow down for the traffic ahead. The very second the Mercedes came to a rolling stop, the trap was violently sprung. Suddenly, a civilian car shot out from a side street and aggressively slammed its brakes directly in front of the general's vehicle, completely cutting off any forward route of escape. Before the young corporal could even react, shift gears, or throw the massive car into reverse, a second vehicle screeched up right behind their rear bumper, boxing them in from the back. Immediately, two more cars swerved aggressively into the opposing lanes, pinning the Mercedes from both the left and the right sides. In a matter of 2 seconds, the commander-in-chief of the Chilean army was completely trapped inside an inescapable cage of solid metal right in the middle of a bustling city street. General Schneider dropped his newspaper and looked out the window in absolute shock. The doors of the four surrounding vehicles instantly flew open, and roughly 10 young men piled out onto the pavement. But these men did not immediately draw firearms, because their specific orders were to kidnap the general alive and violently drag him into one of their getaway vehicles. They had come equipped with something much more visceral and terrifying. They were holding massive, heavy iron sledgehammers. The young men charged the trapped Mercedes-Benz from every single angle. They raised the heavy sledgehammers high above their heads and began violently, relentlessly smashing them into the windows of the car. The deafening, explosive sound of heavy iron completely shattering the thick safety glass echoed down the quiet street, causing nearby pedestrians to scream and dive for cover. The windows of the Mercedes did not just break, they completely exploded inward. Thousands of razor-sharp, jagged shards of glass rained down inside the cabin like a massive fragmentation grenade. The terrifying shower of broken glass hit General Schneider directly in the face, completely shredding the skin on his cheeks, his forehead, and his neck. Blood immediately began pouring down the general's face, soaking into the pristine collar of his military uniform. The attackers reached their hands blindly through the shattered, jagged window frames, trying to violently unlock the doors from the inside and drag the bleeding general out into the street. But despite being completely ambushed, severely cut, and heavily bleeding, General Schneider was an incredibly hardened, highly experienced military veteran, and he absolutely refused to be taken as a hostage without a fight. Ignoring the blinding pain and the absolute chaos erupting all around him, the general reached his hand inside his uniform jacket and unholstered his official military sidearm, a heavy Colt .38 caliber revolver. But as the general raised the heavy revolver to defend himself and his terrified driver, the young men wielding the sledgehammers saw the glint of the gun barrel through the shattered windows. They completely panicked. The meticulous, highly planned kidnapping operation instantly and completely unraveled into a chaotic, blind bloodbath. The attackers immediately dropped their heavy sledgehammers on the pavement, reached into their jackets, and pulled out their own semi-automatic pistols. Without any hesitation and completely abandoning the plan to take him alive, they pointed their weapons directly through the broken windows of the Mercedes and opened fire at point-blank range. The deafening, rapid-fire cracks of the handguns completely drowned out the sounds of the screaming bystanders on the street. General Schneider never even got the chance to pull the trigger of his revolver. He was violently struck multiple times in the chest, the shoulder, and the abdomen. The heavy bullets tore completely through his internal organs, and the massive impact threw him violently backward into the plush leather seats. His heavy revolver slipped from his bloody hand and fell to the floorboards. The attackers, completely terrified by what they had just done, and realizing that they had just brutally shot the most powerful military figure in the entire country in broad daylight, immediately turned and sprinted back to their vehicles. They jumped in, slammed on the gas, and sped away in multiple directions, tires squealing against the pavement, completely abandoning the scene and leaving the general to die in the back of his completely destroyed car. Inside the Mercedes, Corporal Morera was completely covered in broken glass, trembling in absolute horror. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw his commander-in-chief slumped over in the back seat, completely covered in blood and gasping heavily for air. Running on pure, unadulterated adrenaline, the young corporal threw the heavy Mercedes into gear, aggressively slammed the accelerator to the floor, and violently rammed his way past one of the abandoned blockade vehicles. He drove like an absolute madman through the crowded streets of Santiago, blasting the horn and running through red lights, desperately making a straight line for the nearest military hospital. When they finally skidded to a halt outside the emergency room doors, a swarm of military medics rushed out, pulled the critically wounded general from the blood-soaked back seat, and immediately rushed him into emergency surgery. For 3 incredibly long, agonizing days, General René Schneider fought desperately for his life in the intensive care unit. The entire nation of Chile came to a complete, absolute standstill. The news of the horrific, daylight ambush sent massive shockwaves through the government and the military. The newly elected president, Salvador Allende, actually rushed directly to the military hospital and sat vigil, waiting completely anxiously in the hallways, while the surgeons desperately tried to repair the massive internal damage caused by the point-blank gunfire. But despite the absolute best efforts of the medical staff, the damage was simply too severe. On October 25th, 1970, General René Schneider officially succumbed to his massive injuries and passed away. But here is the incredibly ironic, completely spectacular twist to this incredibly dark story. The rogue faction and the foreign intelligence operatives who had entirely orchestrated this massive bloody ambush had assumed that kidnapping or harming the general would cause the military to instantly snap blame the leftists, violently overthrow the government. But the exact opposite happened. The horrific, cowardly murder of their beloved commander-in-chief did not fracture the military. It completely, absolutely united them. The military investigators quickly uncovered the truth, realizing that it was actually right-wing extremists who had murdered their boss. Filled with absolute rage and a deep, unyielding desire to honor General Schneider's legacy and his strict doctrine of non-interference, the Chilean military doubled down on their commitment to the Constitution. They stood in absolute solidarity with the democratic process, ensuring that the presidential transition went completely flawlessly. The massive, highly funded conspiracy to trigger a coup had completely and utterly blown up in their faces, achieving the exact opposite of what they had so violently tried to accomplish. The mastermind behind the attack, Roberto Vio, was eventually tracked down, arrested by military police, and sentenced to decades in a dark prison cell. A targeted political assassination at a bustling city intersection is a deeply calculated, incredibly precise act of violence. But what happens when violence is no longer a targeted bullet meant for a single man, but rather a blind, mechanical storm of death raining down indiscriminately on tens of thousands of completely innocent people? By May of 1971, the entire region of East Pakistan, which is now the independent nation of Bangladesh, was completely engulfed in a massive, incredibly brutal, and bloody conflict known as the Bangladesh Liberation War. The military was violently cracking down on the civilian population, and as a result, absolute terror had completely swept through the countryside. Millions of innocent civilians realized that if they stayed in their homes, they were going to be killed. And so, a massive, unprecedented exodus began. Entire villages packed up whatever they could carry in small cloth bundles, grabbed their children, and began walking desperately toward the border of India, hoping to find safety in the refugee camps there. Deep in the Khulna region, there was a small, normally very quiet agricultural transit town called Chuknagar. Chuknagar was situated right on the banks of the Badra River. Because of its specific geographical location, it became a massive natural choke point for the refugees. To get to the Indian border, you had to cross the Badra River, and Chuknagar was the primary place to find boats and ferrymen willing to make that trip. By the morning of May 20th, this tiny, unassuming river town had completely swelled into a massive, sprawling refugee camp. It is estimated that upwards of 100,000 exhausted, terrified civilians had poured into Chuknagar over the previous few weeks. The sheer volume of humanity was absolutely staggering. Every single inch of the town was completely covered with people. Families were camped out under the massive, sprawling branches of the ancient banyan trees, crowding the narrow dirt alleyways and sitting shoulder to shoulder all along the muddy banks of the river. Despite the incredible overcrowding and the sweltering, oppressive heat of the South Asian summer, there was actually a collective sense of profound relief washing over the crowd that morning. These people had walked for days, sometimes weeks, through thick mud and heavy monsoon rains, constantly looking over their shoulders, but now they had made it. They were at the river. India was just a short boat ride away. All they had to do was wait their turn. As midday approached, the town was filled with the sounds of crying babies, the murmur of tens of thousands of conversations, and the smell of wood fires as women boiled small pots of rice to feed their starving children. It was a chaotic, but entirely peaceful scene of desperate people simply waiting for salvation. But right around noon, the low, heavy rumble of large diesel engines began to echo down the main dirt road, leading directly into the center of the town's market. The massive crowd of refugees parted slightly, completely confused, as three large, heavy-duty military transport trucks slowly rolled right into the middle of the incredibly dense encampment. The trucks screeched to a halt, kicking up a massive cloud of dry dust. For a brief, terrifying moment, an eerie silence fell over the immediate area. The refugees just stared at the trucks, desperately hoping that this was some sort of international aid convoy bringing food or medical supplies. But the canvas flaps on the back of the trucks were thrown open, and several dozen heavily armed soldiers from the Pakistani military jumped down onto the dirt. These soldiers did not have loudspeakers, they did not shout any orders to disperse, they did not ask for identification, and they did not try to arrest anyone. Instead, they moved with a terrifying, completely silent, and highly methodical precision. They casually walked to the edges of the crowd, fanned out to cover all the main exit routes, and began setting up heavy belt-fed light machine guns on metal tripods, aiming the barrels directly into the absolute thickest, most densely packed sections of the crowd. Before the exhausted refugees could even process what was happening or attempt to run away, the soldiers simultaneously opened fire. The deafening mechanical roar of multiple machine guns completely tore through the sweltering midday air. It was not a warning burst, and it was not aimed over their heads. The soldiers were firing directly at chest height into a massive, inescapable sea of human bodies. The sheer density of the crowd meant that every single bullet fired was striking someone and often tearing completely through one person, only to strike the person standing directly behind them. Absolute, unadulterated panic instantly erupted. Tens of thousands of people began screaming in sheer horror, scrambling blindly over one another to get away from the hailstorm of bullets. But because the town was so incredibly packed, there was absolutely nowhere to run. It was a massive, chaotic stampede of terrified men, women, and children. The soldiers did not flinch and they did not stop. They simply stood behind their weapons, completely emotionless, constantly feeding long belts of heavy ammunition into the glowing hot chambers of their machine guns, sweeping the barrels back and forth like they were simply cutting tall grass. Realizing that the narrow streets and the market square were a total death trap, thousands of desperate refugees turned and sprinted directly toward the Badra River. They threw themselves down the muddy embankments and plunged into the water, hoping to swim to the opposite shore and escape into the thick jungle foliage. But the military had anticipated this. Several groups of soldiers immediately repositioned their machine guns right along the elevated banks of the river. As they looked down at the thousands of people frantically swimming and thrashing in the water, the soldiers simply tilted their barrels downward and opened fire on the river. The massacre was so incredibly systematic and relentless that it defies all human comprehension. The soldiers continued to fire their weapons non-stop for over 4 straight hours. They did not take breaks, and they did not show a single ounce of mercy. The sheer volume of continuous automatic gunfire was so extreme that the heavy metal barrels of the machine guns literally began to warp and glow bright red from the intense thermal friction. At one point, the heavy wooden stocks on several of the soldiers' rifles actually cracked and broke completely in half because the weapons had simply not been designed to be fired that many times in such a rapid, continuous succession. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the deafening roar of the gunfire finally began to taper off, eventually giving way to a sickening, heavy silence broken only by the sounds of moaning and the crackle of small fires. The soldiers had essentially completely run out of ammunition, or they had simply grown physically tired of pulling the triggers. The center of Chuknagar and the muddy banks of the river had been completely transformed into an apocalyptic nightmare. Over 8,000 innocent people had been slaughtered in the span of just 240 minutes. The soldiers did not bother to walk through the carnage to check for survivors. They did not attempt to bury any of the bodies, and they did not care who they had killed. They just casually walked around the massive piles of corpses, methodically picking up their unexploded ammunition and collecting the broken pieces of their own shattered rifle stocks so they would not leave any useful military equipment behind. Then, they quietly climbed back into the back of their 3 transport trucks, started the heavy diesel engines, and simply drove away, leaving behind one of the most horrific, concentrated massacres in modern human history. When the military trucks finally disappeared over the horizon, the few traumatized locals and refugees who had somehow miraculously managed to survive by hiding under the piles of dead bodies slowly crept out into the open. What they saw completely shattered their minds. The sheer scale of the death was impossible to process. The dirt streets were literally flowing with blood. But the most horrifying sight of all was the Badra River. Thousands of people had been shot and killed while trying to swim across, and their bodies had remained in the water. There were so many corpses floating in the river that it had literally created a massive tangled dam of human remains. The flow of the river had been completely blocked, and because so much blood had poured into the water, the river itself had actually changed its physical consistency. The water was no longer a murky brown, it had turned into a thick, syrupy, deeply coagulated dark red sludge that stretched as far as the eye could see. The surviving locals were immediately faced with an impossible, completely horrifying logistical nightmare. The South Asian summer heat was incredibly intense, and with over 8,000 bodies rotting in the open air and soaking in the river, the threat of a massive, deadly cholera outbreak was imminent. There were absolutely no heavy machines to dig mass graves, and the survivors simply did not have the physical strength or the manpower to bury that many people by hand. So, they were forced to do the only thing they could think of to save themselves from the impending disease. The locals went into the nearby jungle and chopped down massive, heavy bamboo stalks. They carried these long bamboo poles down to the blood-soaked banks of the river. Standing knee-deep in the syrupy red water, the survivors used the poles to physically push against the massive tangled piles of corpses. For days on end, they worked in absolute traumatized silence, using the long bamboo sticks to painstakingly dislodge the bodies from the riverbanks and push them out into the center of the current, allowing the natural flow of the river to slowly carry the thousands of victims downstream and out into the vast expanse of the ocean. Because the war was still raging and the country was in absolute chaos, this horrific event was essentially completely buried. There was no official investigation, and none of the soldiers involved were ever held directly accountable for the slaughter. It would actually take over 30 years before a formal memorial was finally erected in the small town of Chuknagar to honor the thousands of people who lost their lives in the span of a single blood-soaked afternoon. The thick, coagulated red water slowly washing away into the vast, completely empty expanse of the dark ocean slowly fades into the freezing, totally desolate landscape of an ancient pine forest, a place where the absolute silence of the falling snow is about to be violently interrupted by a terrifying, fiery impact from the sky. In the two stories just recounted, trust served not merely as a bond of connection, but unintentionally as a sharp weapon in the hands of others. Whether amidst the eerie atmosphere of Kisaragi Station or the terror of a remote Thai mountain village, a common pattern emerges. Victims lower their guard completely before an environment or a person they instinctively perceive as safe, familiar, or authoritative. When Humi boarded the train in Hamamatsu, she was entirely off guard. To her, the train symbolized order, a safe, vital artery of Japanese society. Her faith in the infrastructure caused her to overlook early signs of anomaly. Trust acted as a blindfold, compelling her to stubbornly seek logic within a reality that had already shattered. In the Lahu village, trust took on a different form. Harold Young, a seasoned hunter, placed his faith in the stability of the social order. He trusted the village chief's guidance and the village's peaceful nature. Convinced he was in a place governed by rules and protection, he failed to realize that the true darkness stemmed not from the wild, but from his fellow human beings. Why then do people remain blind to obvious dangers? Psychology terms this confirmation bias. We tend to see only what we expect to see. Once we believe a person or a process is benign, our brains automatically disregard contradictory details, constructing a reassuring scenario of safety. It is a survival mechanism, yet also a fatal vulnerability. We often assume we can read others through their body language or words. However, when dealing with loved ones, friends, or authority figures, our judgment is compromised by emotional filters. We do not see a killer or a looming danger. Instead, we see a friend, a companion, or a familiar structure in which we have placed our absolute trust. Betrayal or danger stemming from trusted sources is far more shattering than any external threat. It brings not only physical pain, but also the collapse of the very foundation of our worldview. When trust is weaponized, victims lose more than just their safety. They lose the ability to protect themselves, as they can no longer trust the very intuition that is trying to warn them. Ultimately, these stories are not meant to make us live in a state of suspicion. Rather, they serve as a reminder of the fragility of trust. Humans are social beings. We need trust to survive. Yet, remaining vigilant, observing the slightest shifts in facial expressions or deviations in behavior is essential. Sometimes, the difference between safety and danger lies in the courage to question what we believe in most.